Hey there and welcome back. If you have finally reached the part of the day where nothing more is being asked of you, and the room has gone quiet and the light is low, then settle yourself properly, because tonight I would like to take you somewhere warm and candlelit and 500 years away. We are going to the court of Tudor England, and then across the water to France to follow the life of a young woman who was, by the account of nearly everyone who ever saw her, the most beautiful princess in Europe. She was a king's daughter and a king's sister. She was sold, as princesses were, to a man old enough to be her grandfather, and before she would go, she made her brother, the King of England, give her a promise. Years later, in a cold January in a foreign country, she held him to it, and in doing so she risked the head of the man she loved, and very nearly her own place in the world. This is the story of what she did, and what it cost her, and whether she thought it worth the price. Before we set out, let me say that if these evenings are something you would like to find again, you are very welcome to come along for the next one, and it will be waiting here whenever you want it. And if you feel like leaving a few words before sleep takes you, to say where in the world you are listening from, and what the hour is on your side of the earth, I do love reading them afterwards, whatever the time happens to be. There is a real comfort in picturing all of you out there in the dark, in so many different countries, all making your way towards sleep at once. Hold that thought as we go. And now let us leave the present behind entirely and step back 5 centuries into a world of tapestry and candle smoke and cold stone corridors. Picture this. It is the 9th of October, 1514, in the town of Abbeville in northern France. Autumn rain is falling on the tiled roofs and running in the gutters, and inside a great hall hung with cloth of gold, under a canopy heavy with fleurs de lis, a wedding is taking place. The bride is 18 years old. Her hair, which everyone who described her seems to have mentioned, is a deep red gold, and she wears it loose beneath a coronet, in the way of a maiden going to her marriage. She is tall and slender and grey-eyed, and a Venetian who saw her at about this time could think of nothing better to call her than a paradise. The man she is marrying is 52. He is gouty and ailing, and has buried 2 wives already, and he wants from this girl one thing only, which is a son. Her name is Mary Tudor, and she is the youngest sister of King Henry VIII of England. She has been in this country for a matter of days. She does not speak of what she is feeling, because princesses were not asked, but we know from her own hand what she had made her brother swear before she agreed to stand here at all. Come with me back to the beginning, to a palace on the Thames on a March morning long before this, and let us find out how she came to it. She was born on the 18th of March, 1496, at the Palace of Sheen, on the south bank of the Thames a little way upriver from London, and she was the 5th child of the first Tudor king. Let me set her family before you, because this is a household worth knowing. Her father was Henry VII, and he had come to the throne 11 summers earlier in the most unlikely way imaginable, by winning a battle at Bosworth against a crowned and anointed king, at the end of 30 years of civil war between 2 branches of the royal house. He was a careful, watchful, thrifty man, not much loved and not much given to display, and he had spent his reign doing 2 things above all: filling the treasury and making certain that nobody could ever take his crown away from him. He knew better than anyone how fragile a new dynasty was. He had been the exile with the thin claim once himself. Her mother was Elizabeth of York, and she was the daughter of one king and the sister of another, the heiress of the losing side, married to the winner, in order to knit the 2 warring houses together and end the quarrel in the cradle. By every surviving account, she was gentle and generous and much loved, a great deal warmer than her husband, and the marriage, which had begun as the coldest possible piece of policy, seems to have become a genuinely affectionate one. Whatever tenderness there was in that household came from her. And there was the nursery. Elizabeth bore her husband 7 children, and the arithmetic of that century being what it was, only 4 of them lived past infancy. First came Arthur, in 1486, the eldest son, the heir, named deliberately for the legendary king to make a point about the new dynasty's ancient roots. Then Margaret in 1489, the elder daughter. Then Henry in 1491, the spare son, the second boy, whom nobody at that point expected to reign. And then, after 2 children who did not live, came Mary in 1496, the youngest of them all, the last daughter, and, as things turned out, the last of her mother's children to survive. Consider what that made her in the household. She was the baby. She was 6 years younger than the brother she would be closest to all her life, 10 years younger than the brother who was going to be king. By the time she was old enough to notice anything, her eldest brother was already a young man being prepared for a throne, and her sister was already being negotiated over by ambassadors. Mary was the youngest, the pet, the one with nothing yet decided about her, and there is every sign that she was thoroughly indulged. Certainly her brother Henry adored her, and went on adoring her, in his fashion, for the rest of her life. And that fact is going to matter enormously later on when she does something he cannot forgive. The palace she was born in had a short life of its own. Sheen was an old royal manor on the river, rambling and much rebuilt, and it burned in a great fire the year after Mary was born, at Christmas time with them all inside. They escaped. Her father then rebuilt it from the ground up, larger and finer than before, all towers and turrets and glazed windows glittering over the Thames, and he renamed it Richmond, after the earldom he had held before he was a king. So the house of her earliest childhood was a brand new palace, the showpiece of a brand new dynasty, rising out of the ashes of the old one. It is hard to imagine a more fitting nursery for a Tudor, and that is the note to hold as we begin, because it explains everything about how she was raised and what she was raised for. The Tudors in these years were new. They were not an ancient house with centuries of unquestioned right behind them. They were the family that had won, recently, by fighting, and every single thing they did was calculated to make that winning look permanent and inevitable and blessed by God. The great palaces, the pageantry, the Arthurian names, the marriages, all of it was the argument that this family belonged on the throne, which is why the children of that family were, from the moment they could walk, instruments of policy. Arthur was the future king. Margaret and Mary were the 2 pieces on the board that could be moved abroad, married into foreign houses, and used to buy England allies and safety and recognition. A daughter was a treaty waiting to be signed. Everybody understood this, including the daughters. Margaret's fate was settled early. She was sent north at 13 to marry the King of Scotland in a match her father made to secure the northern border. And out of that marriage would eventually come a line that changed the history of both kingdoms. Mary's turn would come, but not yet. For now she was a very small girl in a new palace by the river, with a mother who loved her, and a father who was fond enough of her in his cold way, and 2 brothers and a sister, and the whole vast machinery of a royal nursery arranged around her comfort. She had no idea that within a few years the warmth would be taken out of that household entirely. But before that, let me give you her mother properly, because Elizabeth of York deserves it, and because almost everything attractive about Mary seems to have come from her. Elizabeth of York is one of the most quietly extraordinary women of that century, and her story is worth knowing on its own account. She was born in 1466, the eldest child of King Edward IV and his queen, Elizabeth Woodville, which means that Mary Tudor's mother was a princess of the House of York, born at the very height of its power, in the middle of the long dynastic war we now call the Wars of the Roses. She grew up the eldest daughter of a reigning king, expecting the ordinary grand future of such a girl. And then, in the space of a few months in 1483, when she was 17, everything she had was taken from her. Her father died suddenly. Her 12-year-old brother became king. Her uncle Richard took charge of the boy, and then took charge of the boy's younger brother as well, and lodged them both in the Tower of London, which was then a royal residence, as well as a fortress, and not in itself sinister. Then Parliament was persuaded that her parents' marriage had been invalid, which at a stroke made Elizabeth and all her brothers and sisters illegitimate and barred them from the throne. Her uncle was crowned in her brother's place, and the two boys were never seen again. I am going to leave that there plainly, as the record leaves it. Nobody knows with certainty what happened to Elizabeth's brothers, and people have argued about it for 5 centuries and will go on arguing. What is not in doubt is the effect on her. In under a year she went from being the eldest daughter of the King of England to being a girl declared a bastard, in sanctuary with her mother and sisters, with her father dead, her brothers vanished, and her family's cause destroyed. She was in sanctuary at Westminster for the best part of a year. Consider what that means practically. A princess of England living in a religious precinct because it was the only place her uncle's men could not lawfully take her, with her mother and her sisters, on charity, in fear, with no idea what was coming. Then, in 1485, an exiled Welshman with a thin claim landed in England and killed her uncle at Bosworth, and became Henry VII, and married her. That's the marriage that made the Tudor dynasty and produced Mary. And I want you to feel what it actually was for the bride. She married the man who had destroyed her family's cause and taken the crown her brothers should have worn. He married her because her blood was the best claim in England, and joining it to his would knit up the wound in the country and make his own weak title respectable. It is difficult to imagine a marriage founded on colder ground. And yet, by every indication it worked. The two of them seemed to have become genuinely attached to each other. He never took a mistress, which, for a king of that era, is close to remarkable, and he never remarried after her death, though he was only 46, and had every dynastic reason to. The scene I told you earlier, where the news of Arthur's death comes and each of them holds the other up by turns and then breaks down and has to be comforted in return, is the evidence. Whatever that marriage began as, it did not stay there, and the country loved her. This is the consistent note in every account. Elizabeth of York was gentle, generous, pious, kind to her servants, and hopeless with money because she gave it away. Her accounts survive in part, and they are full of small payments to people who had done her some service years before, to the poor, to messengers, to musicians. She was, by all the evidence, simply a nice woman in a position and a century where that was neither required nor common, and people responded to it. She was also, of course, beautiful, in the same fair red-gold northern way her daughter would be. So look at what Mary inherited. The looks, obviously. The warmth and the ease with people, which is all over the accounts of Mary's life and is not a Tudor trait on her father's side at all. The generosity that left her chronically short of money, exactly as it had left her mother, and, I would suggest, something else as well, a family memory of what it is like to be entirely at the disposal of other people's politics. Elizabeth of York had been declared illegitimate, hidden in sanctuary, offered as a bride to 2 rival claimants in turn, and finally married to the winner because her body was the settlement of a civil war. Her daughters grew up in the house of a woman to whom all that had happened. She did not live to be old. She died in the Tower of London, in a room not very far from the one where her brothers had last been seen, which is the sort of symmetry history throws up without meaning anything by it. I will tell you how it happened in a moment, because it belongs with the other loss of those same months, and I would rather give you the two of them together. But there is one thing I will hand you now. and I would like you to carry it with you through the rest of the evening, because I noticed it and I cannot now stop noticing it. Elizabeth of York was 37 when she went, and her youngest daughter 30 years afterwards in a brick house in a Suffolk field, having lived a life her mother could never have imagined for her, was 37 too. Because grief was coming to the Tudors twice over and quickly, and it changed the shape of Mary's childhood completely. Let me tell you what happened when she was 6. In the space of 11 months between the spring of 1502 and the spring of 1503, Mary lost her eldest brother and then her mother, and the household she had been born into effectively ended. Arthur went first. He was 15, and he had just been married with enormous ceremony to a Spanish princess named Catherine of Aragon in the greatest diplomatic triumph of their father's reign. The young couple were sent off to Ludlow, on the Welsh border, to keep the state that a Prince of Wales was expected to keep, and there, in the wet spring of that year, both of them fell ill with something, and Catherine recovered, and Arthur did not. He died in early April, and the news had to be carried back across the country to a father and mother who had no idea anything was wrong. There is a story about how they were told, and it is one of the few genuinely intimate glimpses we have of that marriage. The council sent the king's confessor to break it to him, and the king, when he understood, sent for his wife because he could not bear it alone. And she came and comforted him, and told him that God had left him still a fair prince and 2 fair princesses, and that they were both young enough yet to have more children. And then she went back to her own chamber, and there her composure broke, and her women had to send for the king to come and comfort her in his turn. It is a very human scene, 2 people holding each other up by turns, and it is worth pausing on because it tells you the loss went deep in a household not otherwise famous for warmth. Mary was 6. She had lost the eldest brother she can barely have known well, a distant grown-up figure being trained for kingship. But she would have felt the change in the air, the black cloth, the hushed rooms, the way everybody's eyes went now to the second brother, the 10-year-old Henry, who had been a spare and was suddenly the heir to everything. And then her mother did what she had promised. Elizabeth of York conceived again at 36, which was not young for childbearing in that century, and she went into confinement in the Tower of London, and on the 2nd of February, 1503, she gave birth to a daughter. The child was named Catherine. She lived only a few days, and her mother, weakened by the birth, developed the infection that killed so many women in childbed, and died on the 11th of February, which was her 37th birthday. So she lost her mother at not quite 7 years old, and she lost her in the most bitter way possible, in an attempt to replace the brother who had died, in a pregnancy undertaken partly to console a grieving king. The court went into extraordinary mourning. Elizabeth of York was given a funeral of great magnificence, and the whole city turned out for it, and there is a real sense in the records that the country genuinely grieved for her in a way it never did for her husband. And the king himself, that hard and watchful man, shut himself away and would see nobody, and by the account of the chroniclers, he was never quite the same afterwards. He grew colder, greedier, more suspicious, more punishing in his exactions on his subjects. Whatever softness his wife had drawn out of him went into the ground with her. Now think about what this meant for a small girl growing up in that house. She spent the whole of her childhood after the age of 6 without a mother, in the household of a father who was aging, ill, unaffectionate, and increasingly grim. Her sister Margaret was married off to Scotland later that same year, and quit England forever when Mary was 7. Her eldest brother was dead. What she had left of the family she was born into was her father, whom nobody found easy, and Henry, and that, I think, is the key to the bond between Mary and Henry VIII. which runs like a thread through everything that follows. These two were the survivors. They were the two youngest, the two left at home, the two who went through the loss of their mother side by side in that suddenly silent palace, and who grew up in the shadow of a father grown strange with grief. Henry was 11. Mary was 6. For the rest of her life she was his favourite sister, and for the rest of his he could refuse her almost nothing, even when she defied him outright in a way that would have destroyed anybody else. Their father lived another 6 years, and they were not happy ones. He was ill for much of it, and he never remarried, though there was talk of it. He kept his surviving son under an extraordinarily close guard, hardly letting the boy out of his sight, terrified of losing the only heir he had left. And he went on with the business of the dynasty, which meant that even in the middle of all this grief, his youngest daughter's future was being negotiated, because Mary was growing into a considerable asset. She was becoming, everyone agreed, quite remarkably lovely, and a lovely princess of marriageable age was one of the most valuable things a king could possess. Let me show you the girl she was turning into, and the world that was already sizing her up. Let me show you the girl herself now, because Mary Tudor was raised to a particular standard and turned into a particular kind of woman, and both of those things shaped what she did later. She was given her own household when she was 6 years old. That sounds startling to us, but it was normal for a royal child of her rank, and it meant something specific, a separate establishment with its own servants, its own officers, its own nursery and schoolroom and chapel, funded from the crown, with a gentlewoman of good family in charge of her. From 6 she had her own small court around her. She was never, from that age, simply a child in a family. She was a personage with an establishment. Her education was the education of a princess destined for a foreign throne, and it was thorough. She learned French, and learned it well, which was assumed necessary for any English royal woman, because French was the language of diplomacy and of most of the courts she might be sent to. She very probably learned some Latin, the language of the church and of learning. She was taught to read and write in an age when a great many well-born women could do neither with much confidence, and she was trained in the accomplishments that were thought to make a princess ornamental at court. She sang, she danced, and she played musical instruments, and by all accounts she did all 3 well. I want you to notice how different this is from some of the other royal educations of the period, because it tells you what she was for. She was not being trained to rule, or to govern a country, or to argue theology. She was being trained to be magnificent, to enter a foreign court and dazzle it, to dance beautifully at a wedding, to speak charmingly in French to a foreign king, to sit at the centre of a hall and look like the daughter of a great dynasty. Her accomplishments were the accomplishments of display, because display was the job, and she had, on top of all the training, the one advantage that could not be taught, and it made her famous across Europe. Mary Tudor was beautiful. Not beautiful in the polite formulaic way that every princess was called beautiful by paid flatterers, but beautiful in a way that made hardened ambassadors abandon their diplomatic language and simply gush. Here is what they said. A Venetian who saw her called her a paradise, and then, evidently feeling that needed explaining, went on, tall, slender, grey-eyed, with an extreme pallor. Pallor was a compliment then, the mark of a woman who never worked outdoors. Another observer, this one her own eventual husband, the King of France, is said to have called her a nymph from heaven. Erasmus, the greatest scholar in Europe, praised her looks. And the detail that everyone comes back to, the one that has followed her for 5 centuries, is her hair, which was a deep red gold, the true Tudor colouring that her brother had too, and which she wore loose and long on ceremonial occasions in a way that people plainly found extraordinary. We even have, in a strange and rather moving way, physical confirmation of that hair, though it comes from a very long time afterwards, and I will tell you about it properly at the end of her story. Now, her beauty was not a private matter. In her world, it was a diplomatic asset, discussed by ambassadors in dispatches, weighed against dowries, factored into negotiations. A famously lovely princess could be married higher than a plain one because a king, considering the match, would hear about her looks from his envoys and want her the more. Mary's face was, quite literally, part of England's bargaining position in Europe. That is a strange and slightly chilling fact to sit with, that a girl's appearance was assessed and reported on like the yield of an estate, but that was the world she was born into, and she can never have remembered a time when she did not know it. And there is one more thing about her that comes through the record, harder to pin down than her looks, but just as important. She had spirit, charm, certainly, and warmth, and the gift of being liked, which she seems to have had in abundance. But underneath it something considerably tougher, a will of her own and the nerve to use it. You do not get from a dutiful, biddable princess the things Mary did at 18 and 19. You get them from a young woman who had worked out, somewhere along the way, that she was loved enough to gamble on being forgiven. Her motto, which she took as an adult and had embroidered and carved and set on her possessions, was in French, and it translates as, "The will of God is sufficient for me." Read one way, that is pure conventional piety, the sort of thing anyone might choose. Read another way, in the light of what she actually did with her life. It sounds a good deal more like a woman quietly declaring that she answers to a higher authority than the one currently shouting at her. I would not lean too hard on that, but it is there. So, a motherless girl in a great new palace, magnificently trained, spectacularly lovely, indulged by an adoring brother, and possessed of considerably more backbone than anyone had yet had cause to notice. That was Mary Tudor at the point where the men began deciding what to do with her. And before we watch them do it, let me show you exactly how that deciding was done, because the machinery of a royal marriage was a real and formidable institution. Before we go further, let me show you the machinery Mary was inside, because the royal marriage market of that century was a real institution with real procedures, and knowing how it worked makes what she eventually did far more astonishing. Start with the basic fact. A princess was an instrument of foreign policy, and everybody said so openly. There was no embarrassment about it, no pretense that anything else was going on. Treaties between kingdoms were routinely sealed with a marriage, because a treaty is only paper and a marriage makes a blood relationship. And blood relationships were understood to bind in a way that signatures did not. If England wanted peace with France, England sent a princess to France. That was simply how the thing was done, which meant that a king with daughters had assets, and a king with several daughters had a portfolio. Mary's father had two, and he used them exactly as a careful man uses capital. One sent north to Scotland to secure the dangerous border. One held back and offered to the highest bidder in Europe. Both transactions were entirely conscious. Now the mechanics, because they are stranger than you might think. Negotiations began absurdly early. Children were betrothed at 3, at 5, at 7. Mary was 11, which was on the late side. And these were not vague understandings, but formal contracts, drawn up by lawyers, specifying dowry payments in precise sums, the timing of installments, the dower lands the bride would hold if widowed, what happened if either party died, what happened if the marriage were not consummated by a given date. They read like commercial documents because that is what they were. Portraits mattered enormously, and a good deal of nonsense is talked about them. A prince considering a match sent a painter, and the painter's job was to produce a likeness accurate enough to be useful, because a bridegroom who arrived to find he had been deceived would be furious, and the diplomat responsible would suffer for it. Ambassadors were also expected to inspect the girl in person, and report honestly. Her height, her colouring, her complexion, her teeth, her figure, her manner, whether she seemed healthy, whether she seemed likely to bear children. These dispatches survive by the hundred, and they make uncomfortable reading because they are quite plainly assessments of livestock, written about girls of 11 and 12 by grown men in the pay of foreign kings. Mary was assessed this way repeatedly, and the assessments were glowing, which is why we know what she looked like. Then there was the proxy marriage, which is a device we have entirely lost. A princess could not be married to a man 300 miles away by post, and yet the whole point of the contract was that it must become binding before she was handed over, because otherwise she could be sent across a sea and then rejected. So the marriage was solemnized in her own country, with a nobleman of the bridegroom's court standing in his place, speaking his vows. Afterwards there was often a ritual, entirely public and entirely serious, in which the proxy and the bride performed a formal token of consummation in front of witnesses, so that no lawyer could later argue the marriage was incomplete. Mary went through this at Greenwich in front of her brother's court. She was 18, and the man touching her hand or her foot in that room was a French diplomat she had met a few days earlier. Then the trousseau, and the scale of that is difficult to credit. A princess going abroad carried with her the entire visual argument for her family's greatness, and it was assembled over months. Gowns by the dozen in cloth of gold and silver and crimson velvet, furs, headdresses, jewels, linen, plate, hangings, horses, litters, saddlery, chapel furnishings. Inventories of Mary's survive in part, and they are staggering. All of it went in carts to the coast and onto ships, and much of it was still being fought over years later, which is a story I will come to. And then she went, and here is the part that we tend not to feel properly. She went permanently. There was no expectation of a return. A princess married abroad said goodbye to her mother and her sisters and her country on a quay at 15 or 16 or 18, and in the overwhelming majority of cases, she never saw any of them again. Mary's own sister, Margaret, went to Scotland at 13 and never came back to England in her father's lifetime. Catherine of Aragon left Spain at 15 and never saw her homeland again. That was the ordinary expectation. When Mary stood on the quay at Dover, she had no reason to think she would ever stand on English ground again. Now hold all of that in your mind at once. The contracts, the inspections, the portraits, the proxy ceremony, the carts of gold cloth, the permanent exile. That's the machine. It was enormous, ancient, entirely normal, backed by the full authority of kings and the church, and nobody in it had ever seriously suggested that the girl at the centre should have a say. And a 19-year-old widow stopped it. Once. For herself. In a small chapel in Paris, in front of 10 people. That is why this story is worth an evening. Not because a princess fell in love, which happened often enough and almost never mattered, but because this one worked out precisely where the machine was weakest, waited for the exact moment, and broke it. But we are not there yet. And there is one other person growing up in that household who is going to matter more to this story than any king. So let me introduce him now, long before she was allowed to think of him. His name was Charles Brandon, and he was the most improbable man ever to marry a daughter of England, and to understand what Mary risked for him. You have to understand exactly how far beneath her he stood. Start with his father, because that is where the family's whole claim to royal favour begins. Sir William Brandon was a Lancastrian who threw in his lot with Henry Tudor during the exile, and at Bosworth in 1485, he carried Henry's personal standard into the battle. The standard-bearer stood beside his lord and was by definition a target, because to cut down the banner was to break the army's heart. And in the thick of the fighting, Richard III made his famous last charge straight at Henry Tudor, and the first man he cut down was the standard-bearer. William Brandon died at Henry Tudor's feet, in the act of holding up his flag. And this is before that flag became the flag of England. You can see immediately what that brought his family. Charles was an infant when it happened, and he grew up under the protection of the king his father had died for, raised in and around the royal household, as a sort of honorary member of it. Not noble, not royal, the son of a knight, a gentleman of no great fortune, but a boy with an extraordinary claim on the crown's gratitude and a place at court that money could not have bought. And there he met the king's second son, Henry, who was 7 years younger than him. They became inseparable. Charles Brandon was everything an athletic, showy, boisterous boy could want in an older companion. He was big, physically magnificent, a superb horseman, one of the finest jousters in England, funny, easy, brave, and entirely without the stiffness of the older nobility. When Henry became king at 17 and the whole court exploded into tournaments and revels and display, Brandon was at his right hand for all of it, riding in the lists against him, sharing the disguisings, running the great theatrical spectacles of the young reign. He was the king's best friend, and he was that in a real and lasting way, not merely a courtier's way. Henry VIII had many servants and very few friends, and Brandon was a friend. He was also, and this is where it gets complicated, a man with an extremely tangled history where women were concerned. I will keep this brief and plain, because it matters chiefly as an obstacle. Before he ever came near Mary, Brandon had been contracted to one woman, then married her aunt, then had that marriage annulled, and then went back and married the first woman after all, by whom he had 2 daughters. That wife, Anne Brown, died in 1511. He then contracted himself to a young heiress who was his own ward, a girl of about 8, which was legal enough then, and purely financial in intent, but is not a pleasant thought to modern ears. In other words, by the time Mary was old enough to notice him, Charles Brandon's marital record was a lawyer's nightmare, and the question of exactly who he was legally bound to would hang over the couple for years and require the Pope himself to settle. But none of that seems to have troubled the king. In 1514, Henry raised him to be Duke of Suffolk, which was an astonishing elevation. A dukedom was the highest rank below royalty, and there were almost none of them in England, and here it was being handed to the son of a knight because the king liked him. The older nobility were appalled, and it put Brandon for the first time in the outermost orbit of people who could conceivably marry a princess, though nobody seriously thought he would. Now to the question everybody wants answered, which is when Mary fell in love with him, and whether he loved her back. The honest reply is that we do not know, and anyone who tells you the date is making it up. What we can say is this: they had known each other for years in the close daily world of a small court, where the king's sister and the king's dearest friend would have been thrown together constantly at every feast and revel and hunt. He was famously charming and physically imposing, and about 12 years older than her. She was young, beautiful, romantic, and had been raised on courtly literature, in which love and gallantry were the highest subjects there were. And by the time she was 18, when the crisis came, she was so certain of her own feelings and so certain of his, that she was prepared to stake both their lives on them within weeks of being widowed. That is not the behaviour of a woman who has just met somebody. Something had been understood between them for some time. There is even a suggestion, in the sources, that her brother knew, that when Mary made her famous bargain about choosing her own second husband, Henry understood perfectly well who she had in mind and agreed anyway, because in the moment he needed her compliance, and the promise cost him nothing. If that is true, then everything that happened afterwards is not really a story about a king who was deceived. It is a story about a king who made a promise he never expected to have to keep, and then discovered that his little sister had taken him at his word. But that is still to come. First they had to get her married to somebody else entirely, and to see how that happened, We need to go back to the year Mary turned 11, when a very grand match indeed was made for her. In April of 1509 their father died, and Mary's brother became King Henry VIII at the age of 17, and the whole atmosphere of English royal life changed overnight from a locked strongbox into a party. You have to understand what the old king's last years had been like to feel the force of that change. Henry VII had grown ever more grasping and suspicious as he aged, squeezing his nobles through fines and bonds and recognizances, ruling through a pair of hated financial agents, hoarding money, trusting nobody. The court had become a joyless place. When he died there was, frankly, relief, and when his golden son came to the throne the relief turned into something close to euphoria. And what a son he was at 17. It is hard now, knowing what he became, to picture Henry VIII as anything but the bloated and terrifying figure of the later portraits. But in 1509 he was a wonder. He was over 6 feet tall in a century when that was remarkable, red gold-haired like his sister, athletic, a superb horseman and jouster, a genuinely accomplished musician and composer, well-read, fluent in several languages, devout, charming, and boundlessly energetic. Ambassadors wrote home in something like disbelief about him. One of the greatest scholars in Europe said the court had ceased to be a place of business and become a place of the muses. The young king spent money his father had hoarded, staged tournaments and pageants and masques, and gathered around him a circle of young men his own age who liked the same things he did, with Charles Brandon foremost among them. Within weeks of his accession he married Catherine of Aragon, his brother Arthur's widow, who had been left stranded in England in a sort of diplomatic limbo for the better part of a decade, neither sent home nor provided for, while the old king haggled over her dowry. Henry married her almost at once, and for a good long while it was a genuinely happy marriage. She was the elder by 6 years, dignified, intelligent, deeply pious, and Spanish royalty to her fingertips, and the young court adored her. And she and Mary, who was 13 at the accession, became close, which is a detail worth holding on to, because 2 decades afterwards Mary's loyalty to Catherine is going to break her relationship with her brother permanently. So picture Mary in these years, from 13 to 18. She is the king's beloved younger sister, living at the heart of the most glittering court England had seen in living memory. She is the first lady of the realm after the Queen. She dances at the revels. She rides in the hunting parties. She sits under the canopy at the tournaments while men in fantastic costume break lances in her honour. And one of the men doing the honouring, regularly and conspicuously, is her brother's best friend. There is a famous piece of theatre from these years that is worth mentioning because it shows you the texture of that court. At one great tournament, the king and Brandon and their companions entered the lists in disguise, as they loved to do, under invented chivalric names, and the whole court played along with the pretense that nobody knew who these mysterious champions were. That was the register of the place, a permanent delighted game of courtly love and romance, with real weapons and real danger, and a great deal of dressing up. And she herself, beautiful and unmarried, was one of the central ornaments of the game. It is not difficult to see how a girl raised inside that world might come to believe that love and choice and gallantry were things she was entitled to. But underneath the pageantry, the machinery was still turning, because Mary was the most valuable unmarried woman in England, and everybody knew it. She was already spoken for, in fact, and had been since she was 11, and that engagement was one of the great diplomatic prizes of the age. Her brother inherited it along with the crown, and for the first stretch of his reign he kept it in place, and Mary grew up expecting to spend her life in a particular country married to a particular boy. She was going to be an empress. That was the plan, from the time she was a child. And when her brother tore it up, without much consulting her, and substituted an aging invalid instead. It was the shock that set everything else in motion. So let me tell you about the marriage Mary Tudor was supposed to have, and about the boy she spent her girlhood expecting to belong to. When Mary was 11, in 1507, she was betrothed to a boy of 7 called Charles of Castile, and for the next 7 years she was, in the eyes of Europe, his affianced wife. Let me explain who he was, because the scale of this match is difficult to overstate. Charles was the grandson, on one side, of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, which made him nephew to Mary's own sister-in-law, Catherine of Aragon. On the other side, he was grandson to the Holy Roman Emperor. Through his father, he stood to inherit the Burgundian lands, which meant the immensely rich cloth-producing cities of the Low Countries. Through his mother, Spain, and everything Spain was beginning to acquire across the ocean. Through his other grandfather, in due course, the imperial title itself. In other words, this small boy was going to grow up into the most powerful man in the world. He became the Emperor Charles V, ruler of Spain and the Netherlands and much of Italy and Austria and the new empire in the Americas, and the dominant figure of the entire 16th century, the man who would one day hold Europe in one hand and refuse to let Mary's brother divorce his aunt. And at 11, Mary Tudor was formally promised to him. For the Tudors, this was everything they had worked for. Remember, this dynasty was 20 years old, and its whole preoccupation was proving it belonged. To betroth the king's daughter to the heir of Spain, Burgundy, and the Empire was the loudest possible statement that the Tudors were now a first-rank royal house, treated as equals by the oldest blood in Christendom. Mary's father lived just long enough to see it arranged, and it must have satisfied him profoundly. And for Mary, who was 11, this is the part I want you to sit with for a moment, because it is easy to read these matches as diplomacy on paper and forget there was a child on the end of them. From the age of 11, she knew the entire shape of her life. She would go to the Low Countries. She would be Duchess of Burgundy, and then Queen of Spain, and then Empress. She would learn the languages. She would take on that world. She would bear that boy's children. Everything she was taught from 11 onwards was pointed at that destination. She would have been shown his portrait. She would have thought about him, wondered about him, tried to imagine the person she was going to spend her life beside. That is what a child does with such information. She had 7 years to build a future in her head. There were even public ceremonies binding it. A formal betrothal was conducted by proxy, with an ambassador standing in for the absent boy, and Mary went through the words in a great ceremony at court. She was addressed at times as the Princess of Castile. Ambassadors reported on her progress. Gifts and portraits went back and forth. For all practical purposes, for those 7 years, she was regarded across Europe as the future empress, and she regarded herself that way too. And it never happened. The reason is dreary and entirely typical of the period. Alliances in that world were not friendships, they were positions, and positions shifted constantly. Mary's brother spent the first years of his reign trying to be a warrior king in the old style, going to war in France in alliance with Spain and the Empire, dreaming of reconquering the French territories his ancestors had lost. And his allies used him. They took English money and English troops, made their own separate arrangements with France when it suited them, and left him exposed. Twice. Henry, who was young and proud and easily wounded in his pride, came out of that experience feeling betrayed by his wife's father and by the emperor, and looking about for a way to punish them. Bah! Meanwhile, Charles's grandfather kept finding reasons to postpone the wedding. The date was set and moved and set again and moved again. By 1514, Mary was 18, well past the age when such a match would normally have been consummated, and the boy she was promised to was 14. and being dangled by his family as a bargaining piece elsewhere. The insult was becoming public. All Europe could see that England's princess was being kept waiting, and then Mary's brother, and the man who was rapidly becoming his indispensable minister, Thomas Wolsey, worked out a way to turn the humiliation into a triumph. If Spain and the Empire had abandoned England, then England would abandon them, and do it by making peace with the enemy. Make a treaty with France, and seal it as such treaties always were sealed, with a marriage. There was one obvious English princess available for the purpose, and the King of France, who wanted the match very much, was a widower of 52. So in the summer of 1514, the betrothal that had governed Mary's entire imagined future was formally repudiated, and she was told she was going to France instead. She was 18 years old, and by every account that survives, she was horrified. The man Mary was now to marry was Louis XII, King of France, and I want to give him properly, because it would be easy to make him a monster of the story, and he was not one. He was simply old and ill and desperate, and she was 1862, which made him 34 years older than his bride. He had come to the throne in 1498, and he had been, on the whole, a decent king by the standards of the age. His own people called him the father of the people, a title granted him by an assembly of his subjects, and he seems to have earned it. He lightened taxes, reformed the courts, and made a serious effort to be just. He was not cruel. He was not a tyrant. He was, by the time Mary met him, a tired man who had spent most of his reign fighting expensive and largely fruitless wars in Italy, and whose body was giving out on him. He suffered badly from gout, which in that century meant real and grinding pain, and from other complaints the sources describe only vaguely. He was worn out, and he had one overwhelming problem, which is the entire reason Mary Tudor was on a ship to France. He had no son. Let me explain why that mattered so absolutely in France, and not, say, in England. France was governed by an ancient rule, usually called the Salic law, which held that the crown could not pass through a woman. Not to a daughter, and not through a daughter to her son. In England, a woman inheriting was awkward and contested, but not impossible. In France, it was simply barred, which meant that a French king without a son had no heir of his own body at all, and the crown would go sideways to whichever male cousin stood nearest in the male line. Louis had been married twice. His first marriage had been forced on him as a boy by his cousin the king, to that king's daughter Joan, a gentle and deeply pious woman with a physical disability, whom Louis never wanted and never pretended to want. The moment he came to the throne, he had the marriage annulled in proceedings that were humiliating to her and not very creditable to him, and she withdrew from the world and founded a religious order and was in time made a saint. It is a sad footnote, and I mention it only because it tells you that Louis was entirely capable of treating a wife as an obstacle when the succession was at stake. His second marriage was the great one. He married Anne of Brittany, who had been the wife of his predecessor, and who brought with her the independent Duchy of Brittany, the last great territory outside the French crown's control. That marriage lasted 15 years and produced 2 surviving daughters, Claude and Renée, and no living son. And in January of 1514, Anne died. So there he was, 52, widowed, ailing, gouty, with 2 daughters and no heir. And standing in the wings, waiting, was his cousin and son-in-law, Francis of Angoulême, a vigorous young man of 19, married to Louis's daughter Claude, who would inherit everything the moment Louis stopped breathing. There is an old story that Francis's mother had watched Louis's every illness for years with undisguised hope, and called her son her Caesar, and prayed openly for the old king's death, Whether or not that is exactly true, it captures the atmosphere. The whole French court was waiting for Louis to die, and everybody knew it, and Louis knew it most of all. A son would change everything. A son would displace Francis entirely and secure the line and give the old king a kind of victory over the young man circling his deathbed. And to get a son you need a young wife, which is where the English princess came in. She was a healthy, famously beautiful, from a fertile family, and the sister of a king with whom France urgently wanted peace. She was, from the French point of view, an ideal solution to a dynastic emergency. Louis wanted her very much, and pressed hard for the match, and agreed to terms that were generous by the standards of such things. Now turn it around and look at it from the other end, from the bedchamber at Greenwich, where an 18-year-old was being told what had been arranged for her. She had spent 7 years expecting to marry a boy her own age and become the greatest empress in Europe. That was gone. Instead, she was to be handed to a man old enough to be her grandfather, a man in visible physical decline, in a country whose language she spoke but whose court she did not know, for the specific and openly stated purpose of producing a child before he died. And everybody involved understood that the most likely outcome was exactly what happened, that he would die within a year or two, and she would be a widow before she was 20, still young, still valuable, and available to be sold a second time to whoever her brother next needed to please. The sources are unanimous that she did not want it. They use words like horror. She wept. She protested. She was, by every indication, genuinely frightened and genuinely grieved, and she said so to her brother, out loud. And then she did something that no one seems to have expected of her, and it is the hinge on which her entire life turns. But before I tell you what, I have to tell you about her sister, because 400 miles to the north, something had just happened that showed Mary exactly what was possible. There is one person I have not given proper weight to yet, and she matters enormously to what happened next, because she had already done a version of it. Mary's elder sister, Margaret Tudor, Queen of Scots. Margaret was born in 1489, 7 years before Mary, and their father married her to James IV, King of Scotland, in a match designed to end centuries of border warfare. She went north in 1503, at 13, in an enormous ceremonial progress, and the poets wrote about the marriage as the union of the thistle and the rose. Mary was 7 when her sister left. It is very unlikely they ever met again. Margaret's marriage was reasonably successful and produced several children, most of whom died as infants, in the way of that century. And then, in September of 1513, the peace her marriage was meant to guarantee collapsed entirely. Mary's brother went to war in France. Scotland honoured its old alliance with the French, and James IV crossed the border with a large army and was met at Flodden by an English force, and it went catastrophically for the Scots. The king was killed. So were a very large number of the Scottish nobility in what remains one of the worst days in that country's history. Margaret was 23, pregnant, and suddenly regent of Scotland for her infant son, in a country that had just been shattered by her own brother's kingdom. Her position was impossible. She was English in a nation that had just buried its king because of England. She was a woman ruling in a kingdom of powerful, armed, quarrelsome lords. And her authority as regent depended on a condition written into her late husband's will. She held it only so long as she remained a widow. And in August of 1514, Margaret Tudor secretly married Archibald Douglas, Earl of Angus, a young Scottish nobleman, for love so far as anyone can tell, or at least for something that was not policy, without consulting her brother the King of England, and without consulting the Scottish Council. It cost her the regency almost at once, The Lords used it against her immediately. She lost the guardianship of her sons, and the following years of her life were a grinding sequence of factions and flights and reversals. The marriage itself turned out badly. Angus was unfaithful and grasping, and she spent years extricating herself from him, and eventually obtained a divorce, and then married again, a third time. Now put the dates side by side, because this is the part that matters. That secret Scottish marriage happened in the same month, almost to the day, that Mary was married by proxy at Greenwich to Louis XII of France. So while the younger sister was standing in a room at Greenwich going through a ceremony with a French diplomat standing in for a man of 52, her sister 400 miles north was quietly marrying a young man of her own choosing. The news would have reached the English court within weeks, and it would have arrived exactly during the 6 weeks Mary spent waiting to sail. She would have heard of it at Dover, or on the road there. And I think it is impossible that she did not draw the obvious conclusion. Here was proof, delivered to her at the precise moment she needed it, that a Tudor princess could do this, that a royal widow could simply marry the man she wanted, in secret, and present the world with a completed fact. Her own sister had done it. The King of England had been furious about it, and had been able to do very little, because Scotland was not his to command, and the thing was done. That is the precedent. It does not diminish Mary's courage in the least, because Margaret was a reigning Queen Regent in an independent kingdom, while her sister would be an English subject's wife inside her brother's reach, which was a far more dangerous position. But it does mean that when Mary made her bargain with Henry in the summer of 1514, and when she acted on it in Paris the following March, she was not inventing something unimaginable. She had watched her elder sister demonstrate that it could be attempted. There is a melancholy postscript. The two sisters took the same gamble, and it went very differently. Margaret's love match brought her 20 years of misery, factional warfare, the loss of her children's custody, and eventually a divorce. Mary's brought her 18 years of quiet marriage in a Suffolk field. One of them chose well, and one of them chose badly, and there was no way for either to know in advance. Margaret died in 1541, 8 years after her sister, having outlived nearly everyone. Through her son came a granddaughter called Mary, Queen of Scots, and through that line, in the end, the crowns of England and Scotland were joined. So both of Henry VIII's sisters married for love against his wishes, and both lines eventually produced a claimant to his throne. He would have found that intolerable, and he did not live to see it. So back to Mary in the summer of 1514, with her sister's news in her ears. She did not simply refuse the French marriage, which would have got her nowhere. She negotiated. What Mary Tudor did in the summer of 1514 was to go to the King of England and tell him that she would obey him and marry the man he had chosen, and go to France without complaint, on one condition, that if she outlived Louis, she would choose her second husband herself. And her brother agreed. I want to slow down here, because this single exchange is the most important thing that ever happened to her, and everything that follows is the working out of it. Consider first how extraordinary the request was. Royal women did not choose. That was the whole architecture of their existence. A princess was a diplomatic instrument, and the value of the instrument lay precisely in the fact that it could be directed wherever the crown's interest pointed, again and again if necessary. A widowed princess was not retired from service. She was a piece returned to the board, often more useful than before, because she came with a dour income and proven fertility and existing foreign connections. Mary was asking to be taken off the board permanently after one use. She was asking, in effect, for her own life back. Consider second why Henry said yes. He needed her. The French treaty was the centerpiece of his new foreign policy, The answer to the humiliation Spain and the Empire had dealt him, and the marriage was the seal on it. A bride who wept publicly and had to be dragged aboard ship would have been an embarrassment in front of all Europe. A bride who went willingly and charmingly was worth a great deal. He needed her compliance, and he needed it quickly, and the price she named cost him nothing at all in the present moment. Louis might live another decade. Mary might die in childbed. The promise was cheap because it was contingent and distant, and Henry VIII was a man who made promises easily. And consider third the thing that hangs over the whole exchange, which is whether he knew who she meant. There is a real possibility, taken seriously by historians, that Henry understood perfectly well that his sister already had somebody in mind, and that the somebody was his own closest friend. The court was a small world. If there was an attachment between Mary and Charles Brandon, the king was hardly the last person to notice it, and there is a suggestion that Henry may even have found the idea faintly amusing in the abstract, the sort of thing one might allow a beloved sister at some vague future date, without ever intending to be held to it, in a real and specific and politically inconvenient present. If that is right, then what happened the following spring was not a deception practiced on him. It was a man discovering that words he had spoken carelessly were going to be quoted back at him. We do not know whether the promise was written down. Most likely it was not. Most likely it was spoken between a brother and a sister in a private room in the middle of a difficult scene, which matters enormously because it means that when the moment came, Mary had no document to produce. She had only her brother's word and her willingness to say out loud, in writing, to the King of England that he had given it. There is something almost breathtaking in the coolness of it when you consider she was 18. She did not rage or refuse or run. She looked at a situation in which she had almost no power and found the one moment at which she had any leverage at all, which was the moment before she gave her consent, and she spent that leverage on the only thing she actually wanted. It is the move of a chess player, not a child. And she was right about all of it. Right that Louis would not live long. Right that she would be a valuable widow. Right that the pressure to remarry her elsewhere would come instantly. And right that her only defence would be a promise extracted in advance. So the bargain was struck, and the machinery started to move. On the 13th of August, 1514, at Greenwich, Mary was married to Louis by proxy, which was the standard practice for a royal marriage across a border. A French nobleman stood in for the absent king and spoke his vows, and Mary spoke hers, and the two were declared man and wife. There was a ceremony afterward whose symbolism is very strange to modern eyes, and was entirely serious then. The proxy, in the presence of witnesses, touched the bride in a formal representation of the marriage's consummation to make the union legally unbreakable. Mary, dressed in the French style, went through it in front of her brother's court. She was now, in law, Queen of France, though she had never laid eyes on her husband. And there were 6 weeks to prepare, dressmakers and jewellers and inventories of selecting which English attendants would go with her, of learning who was who at the court she was joining, of packing up a princess's life into carts. 6 weeks for an 18-year-old to make her peace with what was coming, holding in her hand nothing but her brother's word about what might be allowed to happen afterwards. Then, in late September, the whole enormous procession went down to Dover to wait for a wind. They came down to Dover at the end of September and had to wait there for weeks, because the weather would not let them go. And I find this stretch of the story unexpectedly moving, so let me give it to you slowly. Picture the scene. The castle on the cliff above the harbour, grey and enormous, the oldest and most important fortress on that coast. Below it the town and the little port, suddenly crammed with the households of a king and a queen and a princess, with hundreds of horses, with carts of luggage, with the ships waiting at anchor, all of it packed and waiting, and the whole of that magnificent baggage sitting there in the rain while the weather decided when it would be allowed to leave. And the wind sat in the wrong quarter, day after day, and the sea ran high, and they could not sail. In an age of sail you did not cross the channel when it chose to be difficult. You sat on the shore and waited on the weather like everybody else, king or not. So the party stayed at Dover for some weeks, and Mary had that time, which must have been a strange and suspended sort of time. Her brother was there, and Catherine of Aragon was there, and there were entertainments to fill the days, and all the while the sea outside was refusing to let her go to the life that had been arranged for her. I imagine there were mornings when she woke and heard the wind still in the wrong direction, and felt something between relief and dread. Then, at last, at the beginning of October, the weather turned enough to risk it, and they went down to the harbour in the very early morning, before dawn. And here is the farewell. Henry took his sister down to the water himself. He was 23, and she was 18, and they were the last two of their mother's children left in England, and they had been through the deaths and the silences of that household together, and now she was being put on a ship. Whatever else Henry VIII was or became, he loved this sister, and the parting was reported as an emotional one. She was his, and he was giving her away. And it is at this parting, according to the tradition, that the promise was renewed, that standing on the quay in the dark, or in the days just before it, Mary made her brother say it again, that she had done what he asked, and that the next time the choice would be hers. Whether the words were spoken exactly then hardly matters. What matters is that both of them knew what had been agreed, and that she was going aboard on the strength of it. Then the crossing, which was awful. The weather turned on them almost at once. The fleet was scattered by a storm in mid-channel, ships driven apart in the dark and the rain, and Mary's own vessel was in real danger. The sea and the narrow seas can be vicious in October, short and steep and confused, and these were small wooden ships crowded with people and baggage. Some of the fleet were blown far off course. At least one vessel was lost or wrecked. The princess who was to be Queen of France spent her wedding voyage in the middle of a gale, in a cabin that heaved and streamed, among terrified women, listening to the working of the timbers. They made the French coast at Boulogne, and could not get properly into the harbour, and there is an account that she had to be brought ashore through the shallows in the arms of one of the gentlemen of her escort, soaked and shaken, at the end of it. Whether or not the detail is exact, the picture it leaves is the true one. An 18-year-old girl arriving in a foreign country wet through and half-wrecked, to be handed over to a man she had never met. She had a few days to recover, and then the machinery took hold of her again. She was received with great ceremony, and dressed and put on a horse, and escorted inland toward Abbeville, where the King of France was waiting for his bride. And then somebody had an idea about how the first meeting should go, and it tells you almost everything about the theatrical world these people lived in. The King of France did not wait at Abbeville for his bride to be delivered to him. He rode out to meet her on the road, in what was arranged to look like an accident, and the two of them performed a chance encounter in front of several hundred people who all knew perfectly well it had been planned to the minute. Here's how it worked. Mary was riding toward the town in procession, mounted, magnificently dressed, surrounded by her escort, and Louis, with a party of his own gentlemen, came out as though he happened to be hunting or hawking in that direction, and the two companies met on the road, and the king rode up to her, and this aging gouty man performed the part of a gallant, and she performed the part of the surprised and delighted maiden, and they greeted each other as though the whole thing were a happy accident of fortune. She, according to the accounts, behaved beautifully. She let him kiss her. She was charming, She said the right things in her good French. Understand what this ritual was for. A marriage of state was a public argument, made to an audience of ambassadors and chroniclers whose reports would go to every court in Europe. And the argument being made here was that this was not a transaction between an old invalid and a girl who had been sold, but a romance. A king riding out in eagerness to meet his beautiful bride, unable to wait, coming upon her by happy chance on the road. Everyone participated in the fiction. It was choreography, and Mary, who had grown up in the most theatrical court in Northern Europe, and had been trained since childhood in exactly this kind of performance, executed it flawlessly. That is worth pausing on. She was miserable about this marriage. She had wept over it, argued about it, extracted a bargain to get through it. And on the day in front of Europe, she was faultless, gracious, radiant. Word perfect. That is not weakness. That is discipline of a very high order, and it is the same steadiness she would need a few months later when she gambled everything. The formal entry into Abbeville came next, and it was a spectacle of the kind that town would not see again in 100 years. Tapestries and cloths hung from the windows, the streets sanded and strewn, the guilds and the clergy turned out in procession, pageants staged at the gates with allegorical figures declaiming verses about peace between the two kingdoms, and Mary carried through the middle of it in a litter or on a white horse, dressed in cloth of gold, with her red gold hair loosed down her back beneath a jewelled coronet, in the manner of a virgin bride. The crowds, by every account, were astonished by her. He was the best possible advertisement for the treaty. And on the 9th of October 1514, in the church at Abbeville, she was married to Louis XII in person. We know a certain amount about how she looked, because ambassadors made a point of recording it. Cloth of gold, in the French fashion, with ermine, a coronet of jewels, the famous hair worn loose and long. She was 18, he was 52, and he had been ill, and he was helped through parts of the ceremony, and he was visibly delighted with her. He gave her extraordinary jewels, including one enormous stone that was among the treasures of the French crown, and he made a great deal of her in public. And then the wedding night, which I will handle briefly and plainly, because there is a bawdy contemporary joke about this marriage that has followed it for 5 centuries, and I am not going to repeat it. What can be said is this. The marriage was consummated, and the king announced as much the following morning with considerable satisfaction, and none of it can have been anything but frightening for her. She was alone in a foreign country with an ailing stranger 3 times her age, and whatever she felt about it, she kept to herself, as she had been trained to. There is one thing we do know she felt, because she wrote about it. Within days, Louis dismissed most of her English household and sent them home. This was not unusual. Foreign brides were routinely stripped of their own people, so that they would attach themselves to the new court instead of remaining an English enclave inside it. But for Mary, it was a genuine blow, because among those sent away was the woman who had been her chaperone and companion, an experienced older gentlewoman named Lady Guildford, whom she called Mother Guildford, and plainly relied on absolutely. She wrote to her brother and to Wolsey begging for her to be sent back. The letters survive, and they are the letters of a frightened young woman. She says she is alone, that she has nobody about her she can speak to, that she does not know how to manage. She did not get her back. So there she was, Queen of France, crowned with a nation's jewels, at the summit of everything a princess could be told to want, and completely alone. A handful of her younger attendants were allowed to stay on. Among them, as a maid of honour of about 13, was a sharp, dark-eyed girl called Anne Boleyn, who would remain in France for years afterwards and come home with French manners and French style and change the history of England. There is a strange pleasure in knowing they were in the same room. Mary would come to loathe her, but that is nearly 20 years off. For now it is November, and there is a coronation to get through. On the 5th of November 1514, Mary Tudor was crowned Queen of France in the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, and the next day she entered Paris in triumph, and for a few weeks she was one of the most magnificently celebrated women in Europe. Saint-Denis is the place to begin, because it is not an ordinary church. It stands just north of Paris, and it was the burial place of the kings of France, going back centuries, an enormous Gothic building crowded with the tombs of dead monarchs, the very heart of French royal memory. Kings were crowned at Reims and buried at Saint-Denis. Queens were crowned at Saint-Denis. To be anointed in that building was to be inserted into a line stretching back into legend. Picture the day. November light through the tall windows, cold stone, the church packed to the walls with the peerage of France, the great tombs standing in the shadows all around Mary in cloth of gold, the long ceremony in Latin of a queen's coronation, the anointing with holy oil, the ring, the sceptre, the crown set on her head. And because the crown of a French queen was a heavy thing and she had a long service to endure, a nobleman stood beside her through much of it and held the weight of it above her head, which is the sort of detail that makes the whole scene suddenly real. The man appointed to that duty, or one of the men closest to her through those ceremonies, was Francis of Angoulême, the heir, the young man who would take everything the moment Louis died. He was 19, 3 years older than the girl he was attending, and his entire future depended on this 18-year-old not producing a son. Consider the two of them standing there together in the candlelight, the new queen and the waiting heir, each perfectly aware of what the other represented. The next day came the entry into Paris, and if the coronation was sacred theatre, this was civic theatre on the grandest scale. The city put on a series of elaborate staged pageants at the gates, and along the route, allegorical tableaux with actors and machinery and verses, all of them hammering the same message, peace between England and France. The lily and the rose joined, the new queen as the bringer of concord. She was carried through it in a litter, and the crowds turned out in tens of thousands, and by the accounts that survive, they were genuinely delighted with her because she was young and lovely and smiling, and looked like exactly what the pageant said she was. So that was the height of it. Anointed at Saint-Denis, acclaimed through Paris, wearing the jewels of the French crown, everything a princess was raised for, achieved before she was 19. And now let me tell you what it was actually like, because underneath the gold leaf it was not much of a life. She was alone. Her own people had been sent home, all but a handful of young attendants, and the great household that surrounded her now was French, appointed by her husband, loyal to him and to the court, watching her. Her chief companion and protector had been taken from her. She was queen in a country whose ways she did not know, without a single person about her whom she had known for longer than a few weeks. Her husband was affectionate but sick. Louis seems genuinely to have been fond of her, even besotted, and he showered her with jewels and made much of her in public. But he was 52 and gouty and failing, and he could not keep up with a young wife who had been raised on dancing and hunting and constant motion. There is a picture in the sources of Louis trying to live at her pace and paying for it, keeping later hours and eating differently in order to be a companion to her, and at doing his health no good at all. Whatever else it was, this was not a marriage of equals. It was an old man's last effort. And over everything hung the one purpose. She was there to produce a son. Every month that passed without a pregnancy was noticed, counted, reported in dispatches. Ambassadors wrote home speculating about whether the Queen was with child. The entire French court and the English court and half of Europe were watching her body and waiting. It is difficult to imagine a more oppressive form of scrutiny, and she was 18 and had nobody to talk to about it. She wrote home. The letters to her brother and to Wolsey are the best evidence we have of her state of mind in these weeks, and they are not the letters of a triumphant queen. They are full of loneliness, of requests for her own people, of a young woman reaching back across the channel for something familiar. It lasted 82 days. On the 1st of January 15, in Paris, Louis XII died. He had been married for less than 3 months. There was no child, and there was not going to be one. And in an instant, everything about her situation changed. To understand why, and to understand how dangerous her position now was, you need to know who else was in that room with her and what each of them wanted. Let me show you the court Mary walked into at 18, because the France of 1514 was one of the most brilliant places in Europe, and it was full of people who wanted something from her. The French royal court in these years was on the edge of a transformation. Italy had been the obsession of French kings for a generation, and the wars they fought there had been militarily disappointing and culturally transformative. The armies came home having seen Florence and Milan and Rome, and they brought back painters and architects and sculptors, and a completely new idea of what a palace should look like. The France Mary entered was in the middle of turning itself from a late medieval kingdom into a Renaissance one. Within a few years of her leaving, the great chateau of the Loire would be going up, and the King of France would be employing an elderly Italian named Leonardo. So it was a rich, showy, cultivated place, ceremonious in ways the English court was not, with an elaborate etiquette and a great deal of Italian influence, and a very high standard of dress. Mary, who had been raised at the most theatrical court in Northern Europe and spoke excellent French, was in one sense perfectly equipped for it. In another sense, she was completely alone in it, because every significant person in the room had an interest in her. Take them one at a time. Her husband Louis wanted a son, and had roughly a year to get one. He was affectionate towards her, indulgent, generous with jewels, and physically failing. Whatever companionship there was between them was constrained by the fact that the entire purpose of her presence was reproductive, and the clock was audible to everyone. Then Francis of Angoulême, 20 years old, the heir presumptive, tall and dark and charming, and enormously energetic. If Mary bore a son, Francis lost a kingdom, so he had the strongest possible motive to want her baron, and a court that was not slow to notice such things watched his behaviour towards the new queen with fascination. He was attentive to her. He was, by several accounts, rather too attentive, in a way that alarmed people around him, and there is a tradition that his own mother warned him sharply to keep away from her, on the grounds that if he compromised the queen and she then produced a child, nobody would ever be certain whose it was, and his inheritance would be in ruins. Then Claude. This is the figure who most deserves our sympathy in the whole arrangement, and she is almost always left out. Claude was Louis's elder daughter, about 15, and she had been married to Francis in the spring of 1514. She was small, pious, gentle, and physically frail, with a condition that made walking difficult. And she had grown up as heiress of Brittany and daughter of France, and now she was watching her father marry a girl 3 years above her in age, whose only function was to produce the son who would disinherit Claude's own husband. Then, 3 months later, her father was dead, and Claude was Queen of France, at 15, married to a man who was to be conspicuously unfaithful to her for the whole of their marriage. She bore him 7 children in 9 seasons of marriage, and died at 24. Anne Boleyn served in her household for a long while. There is a whole other evening story in Claude, and it is a sadder one than Mary's. Then Louise of Savoy, Francis's mother, and one of the most formidable women in Europe. Widowed young, she had devoted her entire existence to the advancement of her son, whom she referred to in her own journal in terms of near worship, and she had spent years watching the health of successive French kings with the attention of a woman waiting for a door to open. She kept a record of Louis's illnesses. She was intelligent, ruthless, and utterly clear-sighted, and she was to govern France as regent when her son was away at war. And into her carefully tended future arrived a beautiful, healthy 18-year-old English girl whose one job was to close that door forever. You can see, I hope, how uncomfortable Mary's position actually was. She was surrounded by people whose interests were directly opposed to hers, in a court where she had no friends of her own, having been stripped of her English attendants almost as soon as she arrived. Every one of them was watching her body. If she conceived, one faction won everything and another lost everything. If she did not, the reverse. And she was 18, and she had been in the country for a matter of weeks, and there was nobody at all she could speak to freely. This is worth remembering when we get to the Black Room at Cluny and the long waiting, because that seclusion is often described as though it were merely a strange old custom. It was not merely a custom. It was the resolution of a struggle that the entire French court had been conducting around her, in the open, for 3 months. When that seclusion ended, and it was confirmed that she carried no heir, Francis became indisputably king. Louise's long vigil ended in triumph, and Claude became queen. But I have run ahead of myself, because before any of that was settled, Mary had to be shut away for 40 days, and it is the strangest and most vivid passage of her whole life. What happened to Mary in the 6 weeks after her husband's death is one of the strangest customs of that world, and it produced the single most vivid image of her whole life. An 18-year-old girl shut in a black hung room, dressed entirely in white, for 40 days. The custom was this. When a king of France died, his widow went into a period of formal seclusion, and the purpose of it was not primarily grief. It was to establish, beyond any possible doubt, whether she was carrying his child. Because if she was, and if the child was a boy, then that child was king of France, and everything about the succession changed. Until the question was settled, the widow was the most important person in the kingdom, and she was shut away and watched. So Mary was taken to the Hôtel de Cluny in Paris, and there she was installed in a chamber hung entirely with black cloth, with the windows covered, lit only by candles. She was not to go out. She was not to be seen by men other than those with formal business. She was attended by French ladies appointed to the task, whose duties, let us be honest, included observing her closely, and she was dressed in white. That is the detail that gives her the name she carries in French history. White, not black, was the traditional mourning colour for a queen of France, and so the widow in the Black Room wore white from head to foot, and they called her La Reine Blanche, the White Queen. Sit with that picture for a moment, because it is extraordinary and it is real. A girl of 18, in a foreign country, less than 4 months after arriving there, sitting in a room where the walls are draped in black, and the daylight has been shut out, and the candles burn all day, dressed in white like a ghost of herself, waiting to find out whether the last 3 months have left a child in her body. Nobody to speak to, nothing to do, watched. And she knew exactly what was at stake, and it was not only the French succession, it was her own future, and she had been thinking about it since long before she left England. Because the moment the 40 days ended, one of 2 things would be true. Either she was pregnant, in which case she was mother to the King of France, and would be kept in that country under guard for the rest of her useful life, or she was not, in which case she was a 19-year-old dowager queen with an enormous income, an unblemished reputation, the blood of England in her veins, and no husband, which made her the most desirable marriage prize in Europe, and every king and prince and minister on the continent would immediately begin trying to acquire her. Either way, she was in danger of losing herself, and she had, as protection, exactly one thing: a promise made in a private room in England by a brother who was 300 miles away. So she did the only thing she could do from inside that black room, which was write letters. We have them, or some of them, and they are remarkable. She wrote to her brother. She reminded him, in plain terms, of what he had sworn. She told him that she had done everything he asked, that she had married where he wished without complaint, that she had held to her side of the bargain entirely, and that she now expected him to hold to his. And she made it clear, with a directness that is quite startling given who she was writing to, that she would not be sold again. There is a report that she went as far as to threaten that if she were forced into another marriage, not of her choosing, she would enter a convent, which was the one exit from the marriage market a royal woman could take that nobody could legally prevent. Think about the nerve of that. She is 19, alone in a foreign country, with no money of her own that she can reach, no armed men, no allies, entirely at the disposal of 2 kings. And she is writing to the King of England, who was not a man who enjoyed being contradicted, to tell him that he gave his word and she intends to hold him to it. Meanwhile, outside the Black Room, the pressure was already building exactly as she had predicted. The new King of France, Francis, had every reason to want her settled somewhere convenient to him. A Dowager Queen of France with English royal blood was a piece he could play, and there were suggestions of matches with French princes and with the Duke of Savoy, and with others. There is also a strand in the sources, handled variously by different historians, that Francis approached Mary himself in a way that was not entirely proper, and that she deflected him by telling him the truth, that her heart was already given, and that she meant to marry Charles Brandon. If that conversation happened, it was a shrewd move, because it turned a predator into an ally. Francis wanted her out of the marriage market and safely disposed of where she could not be used against him by anyone else, and an English duke of no dynastic consequence was, from his point of view, an excellent outcome, and a brother in England was doing precisely what she feared. He was already weighing offers. Then he made a decision that has puzzled people ever since. He needed an envoy sent to France to secure his sister's jewels and her dower, and to bring her home. And of all the men in England he could have sent, he chose Charles Brandon. In the last days of January 15, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, rode out of England toward Paris on the king's business, and before he went, the king made him swear that he would not propose marriage to the king's sister. That detail is not invention. It is in the record, and it is the most revealing thing in this entire episode, because a man does not extract a promise about something that has never crossed his mind. Henry VIII knew. He knew there was an attachment between his sister and his best friend. He knew what a 19-year-old widow alone in Paris might do about it, and he sent Brandon anyway, with a spoken guarantee that nothing would happen. As to why he sent him at all, the practical answer is that the mission needed somebody of high rank and complete personal loyalty. Mary's dower and her jewels were now in dispute. She had been given some spectacular things by Louis, including one of the great stones of the French crown, and the new French king wanted them back, and England did not intend to give them up. Somebody had to negotiate hard with Francis, and be senior enough to do it, and be trusted absolutely by Henry. Brandon fitted. He was a duke, he was the king's friend, and he was competent. The less practical answer is that Henry VIII was, at 23, a man of enormous confidence in his own arrangements, and it may simply not have occurred to him that a promise given to him could be broken. People did not break promises to him. That was rather the point of being him. So Brandon came to Paris in February, and he found her. Consider what he walked into. Mary had come out of her 40 days. She was not pregnant. She was therefore, as of that moment, the single most eligible woman in Christendom, and she knew that the offers were already being drafted. She had written to her brother reminding him of his word, and had received, one imagines, warm and evasive replies. She had fended off the French king. She had been alone in a foreign court for 4 months, most of that time in mourning, some of it shut in a black room. And into that arrived the man she had wanted to marry all along, sent to her by her brother, carrying instructions to bring her home. There is a phrase from Brandon's own hand about what happened next, and it is the most human line in the whole story. Writing afterwards to Henry, trying to explain how it had all come about, he said that he had never seen a woman weep, so she wept, and she talked, and what she said to him over some days in Paris amounted to this: "If you take me back to England unmarried, I am lost. My brother will find it too convenient to sell me again. He will say the word is not binding, or that this match is different, or that the realm requires it, and I will be on another ship to another old man within the year. The only way I am ever going to be yours is if it is done here and done now," and made a fact that nobody can undo. And she was right. That is the thing to understand about this, because it is often told as a romantic impulse, and it was not. It was a correct political judgment. A promise about a hypothetical future is worth nothing against the pressure of an actual alliance in the present. Mary knew, because she had watched it happen to herself already, that when the interests of the crown required a marriage, the feelings of the woman involved were simply not part of the calculation. Her brother had broken her betrothal to the heir of Spain without much consulting her. He would break a private promise to her far more easily. The only leverage she would ever have was to present him with something already done. But look at what she was asking Brandon to do. He was a knight's son who had been raised to a dukedom 8 months earlier by the personal favour of a king who could take it away again with a word. To marry a princess of the blood royal without the sovereign's consent was, in the law of that country, treason, not a scandal, not a disgrace. Treason, for which the punishment was death. He had 2 young daughters. He had everything he possessed from Henry's hand. He was being asked to gamble all of it, including his neck, on the affection of a man not famous for restraint when he felt himself betrayed. There is a letter of Brandon's from around this time in which the fear is entirely undisguised. He knew precisely what he was risking. He was not a fool, and he was not swept away. He could see the block from where he stood, and he did it anyway. I think it is worth saying plainly what that means, because we are 5 centuries away, and it is easy to let it slide past as a nice romantic story. These 2 people made a decision, deliberately, with a clear view of the consequences, to defy the most powerful man in England, for no reason other than that they wanted to belong to each other. There was nothing in it for either of them but each other. He stood to lose his title, his lands, his position, his children's future, and his life. She stood to lose her income, her standing, her brother's love, and any place at the English court. They had both been raised in a world that told them, constantly and from infancy, that marriage was a matter of property and policy in which personal preference had no standing whatsoever. And they looked at that world and decided it was wrong. So in the first days of March, in a chapel in Paris, with almost nobody watching, they were married. On the 3rd of March, 15, in the chapel of the Hôtel de Cluny in Paris, Mary Tudor married Charles Brandon in secret, in the presence of about 10 people, and one of the 10 was the King of France. Let me give you the room. The Hôtel de Cluny still stands in Paris in the Latin Quarter, and it was then a very fine town residence of the abbots of Cluny, late Gothic, with a walled courtyard and a small private chapel. It was where Mary had been lodged for her mourning, so the same building in which she had sat for 40 days in a black-hung room, wearing white, waiting to learn whether she carried a dead king's child, is the building in which she married the man she wanted 10 weeks later. There is a completeness in that which no novelist would dare invent. The wedding itself was tiny. 10 people, more or less. A priest, a handful of witnesses, no heralds, no procession, no pageants at the gates, no crowds, no ambassadors writing home about the bride's cloth of gold. The most celebrated beauty in Europe, who 5 months earlier had entered Paris in triumph through streets hung with tapestries, married the man she loved in a small stone chapel with almost nobody there. And the King of France was one of the witnesses, which requires a word of explanation, because it seems astonishing. Francis had every practical reason to want this marriage to happen. Mary, unmarried, was a permanent complication for him, a dowager Queen of France with royal English blood, an enormous dower charged on French lands, and the ability to be married by her brother to any enemy France might one day face. Mary married to an English duke of recent creation, and no dynastic weight was a problem solved. The dower could be negotiated, the jewels could be haggled over, and she would go home to Suffolk and stop being a piece on anybody's board. Beyond that, Francis was 20 and enjoyed a good story, and there is something in the character of that king that would have relished being present at a defiant runaway wedding under the nose of the King of England. So he came, and he stood there, and he gave it his blessing, which cost him nothing, and gained him a great deal. Now to the secrecy and the haste, because everything depended on the marriage being an accomplished fact, not an intention, not a betrothal, not a request, a completed, consummated, sacramentally valid marriage that no king and no council could dissolve. A betrothal can be broken. A marriage in the eyes of the Church, properly solemnized and consummated, is extremely difficult to undo, as Mary's brother would spend a great deal of his later life discovering. They needed it done before anyone in England could act, because the moment word crossed the channel, the machinery would start, and orders would come, and Mary would be put on a ship. So they married quietly and quickly, and then they had to tell him. And here is a thing I find very striking. Mary wrote the letter. She did not let her husband carry the whole weight of it, which would have been the natural thing, since he was the subject, and the offender, and the one whose head was at risk. She wrote to her brother herself, and she took the responsibility onto her own shoulders, and the substance of what she said was, "This was my doing. I pressed him, he resisted me, and I would not be resisted, and I remind your grace of the promise you made me before I ever went to France, that if I outlived the king my husband, I should marry where I chose. I have done what you asked of me. Hold to what you promised me." That is a woman of 19 writing to Henry VIII. And notice the strategy in it, because it is not merely brave, it is clever. By taking the blame, she made it far harder for Henry to punish Brandon, because to execute Brandon, he would have to accept that his adored sister was the guilty party and let her lover die for her fault. She put herself between her husband and the axe deliberately, and she knew what she was doing because she knew her brother. She knew that he could not hurt her, and she made herself the shield. They also prudently set about securing a papal dispensation to put the validity of the marriage beyond argument, given Brandon's tangled earlier entanglements, so that nobody could later claim the union was void on a technicality. And they began, through intermediaries, to work on the one man in England who might be able to save them, because there was one man, and it was not the king. Thomas Wolsey had risen from very modest beginnings, to become the indispensable engine of Henry's government, and he was, at this moment, the closest thing Charles Brandon had to a friend at court with real power. Brandon wrote to him in what can only be described as terror, and Wolsey, who had his own reasons for wanting Brandon alive and grateful rather than dead, and replaced by some great nobleman who would resent an upstart cardinal, went to work. The letters went across the Channel in the middle of March, and in England, the King of England opened them. The news reached England in the middle of March, and the King of England's reaction was exactly what everybody had feared, and for some weeks Charles Brandon was a man waiting to hear whether he would be permitted to live. Take the offence seriously, because it was serious. This was not a family embarrassment. A duke had married a princess of the blood royal, the sister of a reigning king, without that king's consent, in a foreign country, having personally sworn to his sovereign before leaving England that he would not do that very thing. In the law of the realm, it was treason. And there was more to it than law. Mary was at that instant an enormously valuable diplomatic asset, the Dowager Queen of France, young, beautiful, fertile, with a great income, and Henry had been fully intending to spend her again. Marrying her to Brandon did not merely disobey him, it destroyed a piece of England's foreign policy and handed her to a man who brought the crown no alliance, no territory, and no money whatsoever. It made the King of England look like a man who could not control his own household in front of every court in Europe. And underneath all of that, most dangerously, it was personal. Henry VIII had been betrayed by the two people he loved best in the world, acting together, behind his back. He was 23. He was proud beyond ordinary measure, and he had a temper. The council met, and the council was unanimous, and what it advised was death. There were plenty of men around that table who had watched a knight's son leap over their heads to a dukedom on nothing but the king's affection, and who now had the pleasure of pointing out that this upstart had committed treason and ought to be arrested and executed for it. Some urged imprisonment at least. Nobody spoke for him. Nobody, that is, except Wolsey. Thomas Wolsey's handling of this is a small masterpiece of political management, and it is why Charles Brandon died in his bed 30 years later. He did several things at once. He wrote to Brandon in France in the sternest possible terms, telling him he had done a terrible thing and putting on paper exactly how grave his situation was, which served the double purpose of frightening him into total submission and creating a record showing that the king's minister had not condoned it. He advised the couple precisely how to approach Henry: total surrender, no excuses, no arguing the promise as a right, and a financial settlement so enormous that it would look like real punishment. And he worked on the king himself patiently, over weeks, letting the first heat pass, and then setting out the alternative in cold terms. Because the alternative was ugly, and Wolsey made sure Henry saw it. Execute Brandon, and consider what follows. You kill your closest friend since boyhood. You make your adored sister a widow for the second time before she is 20, and you make her hate you for the rest of her life. You announce to Europe that the King of England murders his intimates over a marriage, and you still do not get what you want, because Mary is already married, and already, in all likelihood, carrying a child, and no annulment is going to make her a fresh maiden again for the marriage market. You lose the friend, you lose the sister, you lose the reputation, and you gain nothing. Whereas, forgive them, expensively and publicly, and you are magnanimous. You keep your friend, bound to you now by gratitude and debt. You keep your sister's love. You take a fortune off them in compensation. And you present the whole affair to Europe as a king so generous that he indulged a love match in his own family, which is a far better story than a king made a fool of by his sister. Henry took the money. The terms were crushing, and they were meant to be. The couple agreed to pay the king £24,000, an immense sum, in yearly instalments of £1,000, a debt that would hang over the marriage for the whole of their lives together. They surrendered Mary's entire French dower and the plate and jewels Louis had given her, including the great stone that had been among the treasures of the French crown, which went into her brother's collection. They were, in effect, fined into permanent indebtedness. Brandon spent the rest of his life financially embarrassed because of that fortnight in Paris. And there is one more thing in that settlement that I think is the most telling detail of all. As part of the reconciliation, she agreed that if anything should happen to her, or in certain circumstances, her brother would have the disposal of her daughter's marriages. She had fought and risked everything for her own right to choose. She could not win it for her children. That is the exact size of the victory. One woman, once, and no further. There was probably never any real chance that Brandon would die, and Mary had understood that from the beginning, which is precisely why she took the blame in her letter. Henry could not punish her. She was his sister, his mother's last child, the person he had grown up beside in that silent, grieving house, and if he could not punish Mary, and Mary insisted the fault was hers, then punishing Brandon alone was unsustainable. She had calculated it correctly, but they cannot have known that for certain, sitting in Paris in March, waiting for a letter. For some weeks, the man she had just married was a man who might be arrested the moment he set foot in England. He set foot in England anyway. They came home together in the first week of May. But there is one item in that settlement I have passed over too quickly, and it deserves a chapter of its own. There is a diamond in this story, and it is worth a chapter of its own, because the fight over it tells you exactly how the great people of that age valued things, and because it very nearly cost Charles Brandon more than his marriage did. Louis had given his young wife extraordinary jewels. That was expected. A bride of her rank was decked out as a walking statement of her husband's magnificence, and Louis was an old man delighted with a beautiful girl and inclined to be generous. But among the things he gave her was one particular object, and it was in a different category altogether. It was called the Mirror of Naples. It was a great diamond, mounted, with an enormous pear-shaped pearl hanging beneath it, and it was one of the most famous pieces of jewellery in Europe. Contemporaries valued it at something like 30,000 crowns, which is a sum with no useful modern equivalent, but which you may take to mean the price of a great estate or of an army for a season. It had come into the French royal collection from Naples in the course of the Italian wars, and it was understood by the French to be a jewel of the crown rather than a personal trinket. And Louis gave it to Mary. When he died, and the negotiations began about what she could take home with her, the Mirror of Naples became the single most contentious item on the table. Francis wanted it back. His position was that a jewel of that significance was not the old king's to give away. It belonged to France, and it must stay in France. Mary's position, and very much her brother's position, was that it had been given to her outright in a marriage settlement and was therefore hers. Her brother wanted it very much. Henry VIII had an appetite for spectacular objects that amounted almost to a hunger, and the idea of the Mirror of Naples coming into English hands appealed to him enormously. So Charles Brandon, arriving in Paris in February of 15, had this as one of his principal instructions: secure the jewels, and above all, secure that one. And here is where it becomes interesting, because the jewel and the marriage got tangled together, and Brandon used one to cover the other. When the couple wrote home to confess what they had done, part of what made the confession survivable was that they were able to offer Henry things at the same time. The letters in which Brandon abases himself are also, in effect, letters of account. And in the settlement that followed, the whole of Mary's plate and jewels went to her brother, including the Mirror of Naples, which he had already contrived to send or carry out of France. The French were furious. Francis protested. There were bad-tempered exchanges about it for a long while afterwards, and the episode did nothing for relations between the two kingdoms. But it worked, in the sense that mattered to Brandon and Mary. Faced with a choice between the pleasure of executing his best friend and the pleasure of acquiring the most famous diamond in Europe, the King of England took the diamond. I do not say that cynically, or not entirely. Wolsey's careful management and Henry's genuine love for his sister were the substance of the pardon. But it is a matter of record that the reconciliation was accompanied by a transfer of treasure so large that the couple were impoverished by it for the rest of their lives, and that the crown jewels of France formed part of the payment. Mary bought her husband's life with, among other things, her wedding presents. There is something bleakly appropriate in that. She had been the jewel herself, appraised and valued and handed over in a settlement, and now she was buying her freedom by handing over jewels in her turn. And consider what she gave up in cold terms. The dower of a Queen of France was an enormous income, charged on French lands, payable for life. That was the security of her old age, entirely her own, independent of any man. She surrendered it. The plate and the jewels were her portable wealth, the assets a widow could realize if she needed to. She surrendered those. The instalments on the fine went out of the Suffolk accounts every year for the rest of her life, and Brandon died still in debt to the crown. She was never rich again. The woman who had worn the mirror of Naples was, within a decade, borrowing to dress her daughter properly for a wedding. As for the diamond, it went into the English royal collection, and was worn by Henry, and appears in the inventories, and then, like a great many such objects, it slips out of the record. It was probably broken up at some point. The stone and the pearl separated and reset and sold and reset again, which is the usual fate of famous jewels. Nobody knows where it is. It may be in 6 pieces in 6 countries. The most valuable object in this story is gone without trace, and the thing that survived is a lock of red gold hair in a Suffolk church. I find that a satisfying arrangement, and I suspect she would have too. But all of that lay ahead. In May of 15 they came home, and there was a wedding to get through. On the 13th of May, 15, at Greenwich, Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon were married again, in public this time, with the King of England standing there watching, and that ceremony is the moment the whole gamble came out, right? Greenwich was the great riverside palace downstream from London, Henry's own birthplace and his favourite house, red brick and towers along the Thames with the park rising behind it. It was where the court did its most splendid business, and on that day it did the business of publicly regularising a scandal. Understand what the second wedding was for. They were already married. The ceremony at Cluny had been valid, and it had been consummated, and no amount of English disapproval could undo it. What Greenwich provided was not a marriage but a public performance of forgiveness. The King of England, in front of his court, gave his sister to his friend with his own consent and blessing, and by doing so rewrote the story. It was no longer a treasonous elopement carried out behind his back. It was, henceforth and officially, a marriage the king had permitted. The whole point was to be seen, and it was seen. The court turned out. The king was there, and the queen was there, and here is a detail worth holding. Catherine of Aragon was fond of Mary, and appears to have been one of the voices urging reconciliation. Among those present, too, was Anne Boleyn's family, and quite possibly Anne herself, home from France or soon to be. The room contained that day almost every person who would matter in the drama of the next 20 years, watching a love match being blessed by a king who would one day tear his own kingdom apart to get a marriage he wanted. Mary was 19. She had, in the space of 9 months, been married by proxy in this same palace, crossed the sea in a storm, been married to a king of France, been crowned in the Abbey of Saint Denis, been widowed, been shut in a black room for 40 days, married the man she loved in secret at the risk of his life, faced down the King of England by letter, and come home to be forgiven. It is difficult to think of another 9 months like it in the life of any woman of that century. She had also, in the doing of it, achieved the thing almost nobody in her position ever achieved. She had married for love, and got away with it, and stayed married. That deserves to be said plainly, because we have grown so used to the idea of choosing our own partners that it takes an effort to feel how nearly impossible this was. Look along the line of royal women around her. Her sister Margaret, married into Scotland at 13 for the border, then trapped in 2 more difficult marriages and a lifetime of Scottish politics. Catherine of Aragon, shipped to England at 15, widowed, left in limbo for 7 years, while men haggled, married to her dead husband's brother, and eventually cast off. Her own daughters would be married where policy directed. Her granddaughter would be married to serve a scheme and would lose her head for it. Mary is the exception in that entire line, and she is the exception because she saw the one moment where she had leverage and spent it, and then had the nerve to collect. Now, the second half of that sentence, and stayed married. Because the interesting thing about the Brandon marriage is not the drama of how it began, but the ordinance of how it continued. They were married until her death, close on 2 decades. They had 4 children. They lived for the most part quietly in the country. There is no evidence of estrangement, no scandal, no separation. Whatever the marriage was, it lasted, and it seems to have worked. But it was not what she had been, and this is the part of the story that is usually skipped, so I want to give it properly. Mary came back from France as one of the most celebrated women in Europe, and settled into being the wife of a debt-ridden duke in Suffolk. The great income from her dower was gone into her brother's treasury. The instalments on the fine went out of their pocket every year for the rest of her life. She was not going to be an empress, or a queen, or a great figure at any court. The trajectory that had been drawn for her since she was 11 simply stopped, and what replaced it was a manor in the countryside, a husband, children, and a debt. She kept one thing from the wreck, and she kept it with what looks very much like deliberate pride. Everybody at the English court went on calling her the French Queen, not the Duchess of Suffolk, which she now legally was, and which was a perfectly grand thing to be. The French Queen. She was addressed that way, referred to that way in official documents and in private letters, for the remaining 18 years of her life, and she signed herself that way, and when she was buried her effigy wore a crown. She had been Queen of France for 82 days, and she never once let anybody forget it. I like her enormously for that. She gave up an empire for a man, and she was quite prepared to make the choice and live with it, but she was not going to pretend the empire had never happened. So let me take you to the place where she spent the rest of her life, a long way from Paris. The house they went home to was called Westhorpe Hall, and it stood in the flat green farmland of central Suffolk, about 15 miles from the town of Bury St Edmunds, and it was where Mary Tudor spent most of the rest of her life. Suffolk in that century was rich, but it was rich in a quiet, unglamorous, entirely rural way. This was wool and cloth country and grain country, a landscape of low horizons and enormous skies, of hedged fields and water meadows and slow rivers, of small market towns and a great many churches built tall and handsome out of the profits of the wool trade. It was not remote. You could reach London in a few days, but it was thoroughly the country. Nothing happened there. That was rather the point of it. Westhorpe itself was considerable, built or greatly rebuilt by Brandon around this period, in brick with a moat, courtyards, gardens, and enough terracotta ornament on it to be remarked upon by visitors as a very fine modern residence. It is gone now, pulled down in the 1760s, and there are people who saw the demolition and wrote about it with real regret, describing the carved work being smashed up and carted away. What survives is fragments and the outline of the moat and a village that still bears the name. So picture the shape of her days there. A great brick pile with its moat and its bridge standing among fields, gardens laid out in the formal manner, with walks and knots and probably an orchard, because every seat of that kind had one. Stables, because Brandon was a horseman to his bones, and there would have been good horses in them, a chapel and a chaplain, and the daily round of prayers that framed every establishment of the age, a hall for the servants to eat in, and above it the private rooms where the family actually lived, hung with tapestry against the Suffolk damp, warmed by fires, lit in the evenings by candles and rushlight. Putty. And around all of it, the enormous machinery of a ducal household, 100 and more servants and officers, from the steward and the chamberlain down to the grooms and the kitchen boys, all of them to be fed and clothed and directed. Running that was Mary's work now, and it was real work. She had been raised for a court, but the skills transferred. A great household is a great household, whether it stands in Paris or in Suffolk. Now the two children who were already there, because I think this is one of the most attractive things about her. Charles Brandon had 2 daughters from his earlier marriage to Anne Brown, who had died in 1511. Their names were Anne and Mary, and by the time their father brought home a Dowager Queen of France as their stepmother, they were girls of perhaps 8 or 9 and a little younger. They had no mother. Their father's marital history had been, as we have seen, a legal thicket, and their own position in it was not entirely comfortable. Mary took them in and raised them. There is no hint anywhere in the record of the wicked stepmother story, no suggestion of resentment or neglect, or of the new wife's own children being favoured at the expense of the first wife's. She brought them up alongside her own, saw them educated, and in due course saw them married. One of them she took with her to the grandest court occasions. It is a small thing, and the sources do not dwell on it, which is precisely why I trust it. There was no reason for anybody to invent a story of quiet decency about a woman famous for beauty and scandal. It simply appears to be what she did, and that, more than anything else, is the note of the Westhorpe years. This spectacular young woman, who had been crowned in Saint-Denis and married 2 men in 7 months and defied the King of England, came home to Suffolk and got on with the entirely ordinary business of running a house and raising children, including 2 who were not hers. They were not cut off from the world. Brandon was one of the leading men of the kingdom, and had constant business at court, and Mary went up to London and to the great palaces regularly in the earlier part of the marriage, and was received with honour when she did. Her brother's affection for her survived the scandal completely. There are gifts recorded, and visits, and the easy familiarity of a family that had come through a bad quarrel and out the other side. When the king wanted magnificence, his sister, the French queen, was among the ornaments of it. But increasingly, as the years went on, she stayed in Suffolk. Some of that was money. The fine and the instalments and the loss of her dower had left them permanently stretched, and living quietly in the fields was very much cheaper than keeping a great presence at court. Some of it was health, which was to fail her early and badly, and some of it, I suspect, was choice, because she had spent the first 19 years of her life as a public object, negotiated over, painted, reported on by ambassadors, watched for signs of pregnancy by 2 kingdoms, and then she had spent everything she had to buy one private thing. It would not be surprising if, having bought it, she wanted to go and live in it quietly, out in the fields, where nobody was watching. And before I show you the children who filled that house, let me walk you through it from the inside. Here is an ordinary day at Westhorpe, and the bulk of Mary Tudor's adult life was made of just such ones, And the whole point of what she did in Paris was to secure exactly this, and nothing grander. Begin before dawn, because an establishment of that size began before dawn. The lowest servants were up first in the dark, raking out the ashes and setting the fires, drawing water, getting the bread ovens going. Over 100 people had to be fed twice over, and everything was made on the premises, the bread baked, the ale brewed, the meat butchered and salted, the butter churned, the candles dipped. Westhorpe was a small manufacturing village that happened to have a duchess in it. The family rose later, and the day began properly with prayers in the chapel. Every household of that rank had one with its own chaplain, and the day was framed by services in a way that is difficult for us to feel now. Religion was not an activity you fitted in. It was the shape of the clock. Mass in the morning, grace at meals, prayers at night, and the whole year running on the church calendar, with its fasts and feasts and saints' days, dictating what could be eaten and when work stopped. Then breakfast, if taken at all, and then the business of the day. Mary's business was the household, and it was serious work. She had officers to do the executing, but the direction was hers, the ordering of provisions, the oversight of the accounts, the settling of disputes among servants, the distribution of alms at the gate, the management of the still room, where medicines and preserves and distilled waters were made, the supervision of the children's education, the receiving of visitors. So far from London, the mistress was also, in effect, a small local authority. Tenants came with problems. The poor came for relief on fixed days. The parish looked to the great house. There was needlework, which was not a hobby, but a genuine industry conducted by the women of the household together, producing and repairing an enormous quantity of cloth, and it was also the setting for most of the conversation women had with each other. Picture Mary and her daughters and her stepdaughters and her gentlewomen in a chamber with the light coming in, working, talking, one of them perhaps reading aloud. There was music, at which she had been trained since childhood, and which she is likely to have kept up. There was the garden, and gardens in that century were serious, knots and walks and arbours near the house, then the kitchen garden and the orchard and the fish ponds beyond, all of it producing as well as pleasing, and there was the moat, which was ornamental and defensive and practical all at once, and would have had carp in it, and there was riding and hunting, which Brandon loved, and which Mary had been raised to, though her health increasingly closed that off. Dinner was the main meal, and it came in the middle of the day, and in a ducal household it was a formal business, served in courses with ceremony even when there were no guests. Then the long afternoon, then supper lighter in the early evening. Then, as the light went, the household drew in, candles and firelight in the private chambers above the hall, and the family together in a way that great houses only were after dark, and music or cards or reading and prayers, and bed early because the light was gone. Now set that against the alternative life. Had Mary played the game she was raised for, she would have been married within 2 years of Louis's death to some prince of Europe, and she would have spent her 30s as she had spent her 18th year, watched by ambassadors, assessed for pregnancy, for performing in front of crowds, surrounded by a foreign household appointed by a foreign husband, with nobody about her she had chosen. She would have been enormously grand, and she would have been alone. Instead, she had this: Suffolk mud and a moat and a chapel, and a full nursery, needlework in the mornings and the same faces every evening. A husband she picked out for herself, and children she raised alongside 2 more who were not hers and whom she treated as though they were. I do not want to sentimentalize it into something it was not. She was ill for much of it. She was in debt for all of it. She was, by the standards she had been raised to, in obscurity, and there is evidence she minded that. She kept the title of French Queen. She went to court when she could. She cared about precedence and rank all her life. She had not renounced the world. She had simply chosen one thing above it, and then had to live with the arithmetic. But when we come to the end of her story, and the question of whether she regretted it, that this is what she was choosing when she chose. Not romance in the abstract. This, a house in a flat green county, the same rooms season after season, that ordinary unremarkable business of a life lived among people she loved. That is what she bought with an empire, and she bought it at 19, at the risk of a man's head. Now let me take you into that nursery, because it filled quickly. Mary bore Charles Brandon 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, and only the daughters lived to grow up, and out of one of those daughters came a granddaughter whose name is far better known than Mary's own. Indeed, the first was a son, born in March of 1516, 10 months after the public wedding at Greenwich. They named him Henry. That was not a subtle choice, and it was not meant to be. Naming their firstborn son for the king they had so recently defied was an act of homage, of flattery, and of family repair all at once, and the king stood godfather to him. It is a small piece of diplomacy conducted through a christening, and it tells you how carefully the couple were still managing their position 2 years after Paris. The following year, in July of 1517, came a daughter, and they named her Frances. She was born at Hatfield, and she is the child who matters most for what came afterwards, so hold on to her. Then, around 1519 or 1520, a second daughter, Eleanor, and later, in the early 1520s, a second son, and they named him Henry as well, which sounds strange to us until you understand what it means. Reusing a name in that century almost always signals that the first bearer of it had died. The elder Henry did not live to grow up, and the name was given again to the next boy, in the way of families who could not afford to waste a good name on a short life. That second Henry was created Earl of Lincoln as a child, and he outlived his mother by only a few months. So the arithmetic of that nursery plainly stated 4 children born, 2 sons, both named for a king, neither living to be a man, and 2 daughters who survived. I do not want to hurry past that. It was the common experience of the age, and it is precisely because it was common that we tend to skate over it. But a mother is a mother in any century. Mary buried a small son, and gave his name to the next one, and then died before learning that the second boy would not reach 17 either. Along with her 2 stepdaughters, that made 6 girls and boys in her care at Westhorpe at various points, and a full nursery is a busy, noisy, absorbing thing. Whatever else those Suffolk years were, they were crowded. Now let me tell you about the daughters, because their lives are the shape of Mary's legacy. Eleanor, the younger, married Henry Clifford, who became Earl of Cumberland, and went north to the very different world of the Yorkshire and Westmoreland borders. She died in 1547, still young. Of her children, only a daughter survived. Frances is the one. Frances Brandon married Henry Grey, Marquess of Dorset, in the spring of 1533, when she was 15, and it was the last great family occasion her mother lived to see. And in 1537, 4 years after her mother was in her grave, Frances gave birth to a daughter, and named her Jane Rady, Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen. I will come to what happened to her at the end, because it is the last turn of this story, and it is a dark one, and it belongs there rather than here. What belongs here is Frances herself, who is usually treated as nothing more than a link in that chain and deserves better. She has had a rough time from posterity. Because her daughter's story is so terrible, and because somebody has to be blamed for pushing a reluctant girl toward a crown, Frances has often been painted as a hard, ambitious, bullying mother, and there is a famous passage by a Tudor scholar describing Jane's parents as cruel to her. That passage has done a great deal of work over the centuries, More recent historians have pointed out that it is a single source, that it was written to make a point about education rather than about the Greys specifically, and that the rest of the evidence for Frances is that of a fairly ordinary noblewoman of her rank who hunted, kept a good household, and outlived the catastrophe. What is certainly true is that Frances was 15 when she married and about 19 when Jane was born, and that she had grown up at Westhorpe with a mother who had married exactly whom she pleased. Whether Mary ever told her daughters that story, and what she said about it, is not recorded anywhere, and I would give a great deal to know. A woman who had risked a man's head for her own choice, raising daughters whose marriages would be arranged by her brother, cannot have found the subject a comfortable one. Mary knew nothing of what came after. She died 4 years before Jane was born. What she saw of her family, in the end, was a full house in the country, a husband she had chosen, 2 daughters growing up, 2 stepdaughters she had raised as her own, and a small son with an earldom. It was, by the standards of what she might have had, a modest establishment. It was also, by the standards of what most royal women got, a rather enviable life. But her health was already failing her, and had been almost since the beginning. Let me tell you about the last great public appearance of her life, and about the pain that had begun to trouble her. In June of 1520, Mary Tudor crossed the Channel again for the last of the great public occasions of her life, and it was the most extravagant piece of theatre the 16th century ever staged. It is known as the Field of Cloth of Gold. The event was a summit meeting between her brother and the King of France, held in the English-held territory around Calais, and its purpose was peace, or at least the appearance of it. Both kings were young, vain, athletic, competitive, and enormously rich, and what they produced between them was not so much a diplomatic conference as a contest of magnificence conducted over about 3 weeks in a field. The scale of it is genuinely difficult to convey. Thousands of people crossed the sea. An entire temporary palace was erected for the English king, with real glass windows and painted battlements and a fountain outside running with wine. Hundreds of tents were pitched, many of them made of or covered in cloth of gold, which is where the whole thing gets its name. A field filled with tents, shining. There were tournaments every day, and banquets, and dancing, and a wrestling match between the 2 kings that Henry is said to have lost, which did not improve his temper. Noble families ruined themselves for a generation paying for the clothes they wore to it. And Mary was there at the centre of the English party because she was the one person present who had a foot in both worlds. She was the King of England's sister. She was also the Dowager Queen of France, who had been crowned at Saint-Denis and had once been married to the last king of that country. Francis, who was now the French king, had stood as a witness at her secret wedding. The French treated her with the honours due to a Queen of France, which she still technically was. So there is a scene worth holding in your mind. Mary, 24, walking out onto that field in cloth of gold among 10,000 people, greeted as a queen by the French and as a princess by the English, with her husband riding in the lists in front of her and her brother, competing for attention with the King of France. 5 years earlier, she had been in a black room in Paris writing desperate letters. Now she was the hinge between 2 kingdoms at the greatest party in Europe. It was the last of that kind of day she would have, and there is a shadow across it, because in that same year her husband wrote to Cardinal Wolsey and mentioned, in passing and without much drama, that his wife was troubled by her old disease in her side. Her old disease, which means it was not new in 1520. Something had been wrong with Mary Tudor, on and off, for some time already, and it was familiar enough to her husband and to Wolsey that he could refer to it in a letter as a known thing needing no explanation. We do not know what it was. That phrase, a pain in the side, is the entire clinical record, and across 5 centuries it will not resolve into a diagnosis. Modern writers have suggested any number of possibilities, and one of her biographers has proposed a heart complaint, and others have suggested tuberculosis, and others a cancer. All of these are guesses. What can be said with confidence is only this. From her early 20s at the latest, Mary suffered recurrent bouts of something painful located in her side, which came and went and never entirely went away, and which is mentioned again and again over the following decade whenever her absence from court has to be explained. That is a hard thing to live with in any age. In an age with no effective pain relief beyond drink and opiates of uncertain strength, no diagnosis, no treatment beyond bleeding and purging and prayer, and no explanation, it is harder still, and it changes how we should read the rest of her life. The retreat into Suffolk, the growing absence from court, the sense in the later records of a woman gradually withdrawing from public view, some of that was money and some of it was politics. But a great deal of it was simply that she was frequently and increasingly unwell. Then, in 1528, it got much worse, because the sweating sickness came. This was a disease peculiar to England in that period, and it terrified everybody, including the king, who fled from house to house to escape it. It came on suddenly, with cold shivers, and then a drenching sweat and a violent pain and a great desire to sleep, and it killed with extraordinary speed, sometimes within hours. It struck the healthy and the strong as readily as the frail, which made it feel less like an illness than a judgment. There were repeated epidemics, and the outbreak of 1528 was among the worst. Mary caught it and she survived it, but by every account she never fully recovered. Whatever her constitution had been before, the sweat took something out of it that did not come back, and from 1528 onward she was a genuinely sick woman, in her early 30s, with 5 years left. And it was in exactly that stretch, when she had least strength for it, that the great quarrel of her life arrived, the one with her brother. Her last years were poisoned by her brother's determination to rid himself of his wife, and the reason it hurt her so much is that she had known Catherine of Aragon since she was a child of 6. Let me lay out the connection properly, because it is the whole emotional weight of what follows. Catherine came to England in 1501 to marry Mary's eldest brother Arthur. Mary was 5. When Arthur died the following spring, Catherine stayed on in England, stranded, poor, ill-used, waiting 7 years while the old king haggled about her dowry and refused either to marry her to his second son or to send her home. And through all of that she was there, in and around the English court, a familiar presence in the background of Mary's childhood. Then, in 1509, Mary's brother came to the throne and married her, and Catherine became queen. And Mary was 13. From that point they were sisters-in-law, and by every indication, genuinely fond of each other. Catherine was at Dover for the farewell in 1514. Catherine appears to have argued for mercy after the Paris scandal. Catherine was at the wedding at Greenwich. The two of them were together at the Field of Cloth of Gold. So when Catherine of Aragon is set aside, we are not talking about a political position Mary happened to hold. We are talking about a woman she had known for very nearly her entire life, who had been kind to her, but being publicly humiliated by her own brother. The business itself is one of the most exhaustively told stories in English history, and I will keep it brief, because our subject is not the king's conscience, but his sister's heart. Henry, having failed to get a son from Catherine, and having convinced himself that the failure was a divine judgment on his marriage to his brother's widow, set about having that marriage declared void. It took him the better part of 6 years. It destroyed Wolsey, and it ended with England breaking from Rome altogether. Along the way, Catherine was separated from her husband, from her household, and eventually from her daughter, and she went to her grave insisting she had been his true wife. and Mary took Catherine's side. Openly, consider how dangerous that was. This was the question on which Henry VIII was least capable of tolerating disagreement. Men who crossed him on it lost their offices, their liberty, and in several cases their heads. Thomas More went to the block over it. And here was the king's own sister, at Westhorpe, not merely privately sympathetic, but known to be opposed, in a way that reached the ambassadors and got reported abroad. As to why she did it, loyalty came into it, certainly. Genuine religious conviction, probably. There is nothing to suggest Mary was anything other than conventionally and sincerely devout, and the marriage of a king was a sacrament. But I suspect there was also something more personal in it, and it goes back to Paris. Mary had spent everything she had on the principle that a marriage was a thing you entered into for yourself and were then bound by. She had gambled her position and her husband's life on the idea that a promise, what once given, holds that a marriage validly made cannot simply be unmade because a king has changed his mind about what is convenient. And now here was her brother arguing precisely the opposite, that a marriage of 20 years' standing, blessed by the church and producing a living child, could be declared never to have existed at all, because the man in it had decided he wanted a different one. If he could do that to Catherine, then a promise was worth very little indeed, and Mary, of all people, had reason to feel the ground moving. She had built her entire life on a king's word, and the estrangement was real. In these last years the warm correspondence thins out. Her visits to court become rare. The old easy intimacy between the brother and sister who had been the last two children in that grieving house is gone, and what replaces it is distance, coldness, and eventually something close to a standing quarrel between the Suffolk household and the king's new party. It was not total, and this is the detail that undoes me a little. Late in her life, after years of this, Mary wrote to her brother saying that she would be glad to see him, that she had been a great while out of his sight, and that she hoped not to be so long again. That is a woman who has fallen out with someone she loves, and cannot bear the silence. She disagreed with him fundamentally, she would not pretend otherwise, and she still wanted her brother back. She died not long after writing it, and I do not know whether she saw him again. But the quarrel over Catherine was only half of it, because there was a second woman in the story, and Mary's dislike of her was personal and venomous, and went back a very long way indeed. Mary Tudor loathed Anne Boleyn, and the peculiar sting of it is that Anne had once been her own maid of honour, a girl of about 13 who sailed to France in her train and carried her things. Go back to 1514 for a moment. When Mary crossed the Channel to marry Louis, she took with her a train of English gentlewomen and girls, and among the youngest of them were the two daughters of Sir Thomas Boleyn, a rising diplomat with excellent French connections. Mary Boleyn was the elder, Anne was the younger, perhaps 13. When Louis sent most of her English attendants home within days of the wedding, some of the young attendants were allowed to remain, and Anne stayed on in France, moving into the service of the new French queen after Louis died, and she remained there for years. That French education made her. Anne Boleyn came home to England in the 1520s with fluent French, French clothes, French manners, French wit, and a style of self-presentation nobody at the English court had seen before. And it is precisely that glamour which caught the king's attention. And she had acquired it because Mary Tudor took her to France. So when Anne rose, Mary was watching a girl who had once carried her gloves take the place of the woman she had grown up beside. Her dislike was open, and it was known. She spoke against the marriage. She refused to lend her presence to Anne's elevation. In the autumn of 1532, when Henry took Anne to Calais to show her off to the French king, the same king who had stood witness at Mary's own secret wedding, the French queen did not go. Her absence was conspicuous, and it was meant to be. There was social poison in it too. of the sort that curdles a court. In the spring of 1532, a quarrel between the Suffolk household and the Boleyn faction turned lethal. A gentleman in the service of Anne's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, killed Sir William Pennington, who was Charles Brandon's own chief gentleman, and did it in circumstances that involved sanctuary and a good deal of scandal. Whatever exactly happened, a man of Mary's household was dead at the hands of a man of Anne's family, and the two affinities were now not merely cold, but at open enmity. The question is why it was so personal, because political disagreement does not usually reach that temperature. Part of it was straightforward loyalty to Catherine. Part of it, I think, was rank, and it does Mary no credit, but it is honest to say it. Mary Tudor was the daughter of a king, the sister of a king, and an anointed and crowned Queen of France. Anne Boleyn was the daughter of a knight, the granddaughter of a merchant, a girl who had been in Mary's own train carrying her gloves. For that girl to be raised above Catherine of Aragon, a princess of Spain, and to take precedence over Mary herself, offended something very deep in a woman raised as she had been. And there is an irony in that which I cannot let pass, because Mary must have felt it too. She had married a knight's son. She had defied every rule of rank and blood to do it, and she had spent her whole life afterwards being told implicitly that Charles Brandon was beneath her. She of all people had made the argument that love outranks lineage. And when a knight's daughter did something structurally similar, she was appalled. I do not think that makes her a hypocrite exactly. She would have said, and would have believed, that the two cases were nothing alike, that she had married a widower after being widowed herself, with no wife displaced, and no queen humiliated, and no church torn in half. But it does mean that the woman who defied the world for a love match spent her final years fighting one, and there is a bit of symmetry there that she may or may not have seen. The rise went on regardless. Anne was created Marquess of Pembroke in her own right in 1532. They were married in secret in January of 1533, which is the same word, and nearly the same trick Mary had used 18 years before. Catherine's marriage was pronounced void in the spring, and on the 1st of June, 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned queen at Westminster Abbey with the full magnificence of the crown. Mary did not attend. She was by then too ill to have attended anything. She was dead 24 days later. There is a story, and you will find it in a good many older books, that Mary Tudor was killed by grief and rage over her brother's marriage. It is a satisfying story, and it should be treated with caution, because she had been seriously unwell for 5 years, and had never recovered from the sweating sickness, and had complained of the pain in her side since her early 20s. She died of whatever had been killing her since 1528, but the timing is the timing, and the last thing she knew of her brother's court was that the woman she despised had been crowned in the abbey, and the woman she loved had been cast off. She had one piece of happiness left before the end, and it came a few weeks before she died, and it was her daughter's wedding. The last thing Mary Tudor did in the world beyond Suffolk was to go up to London and see her elder daughter married, and then she went home to Westhorpe and did not leave it again. The wedding was Frances's. She was 15, the same age her mother had been when the negotiations began that sent her to France, and she was married to Henry Grey, Marquess of Dorset, a young man of high birth and royal descent through his own line. It was a good match, arranged in the ordinary way by the two families, and there is no indication that anybody consulted Frances about it any more than anybody had consulted Mary about Charles of Castile or about Louis. Sit with that for a moment, because it is one of the quieter sadnesses in this story. Mary Tudor had fought the whole machinery of dynastic marriage and beaten it once for herself. Her daughters were married exactly as everybody else's daughters were married. She had won a personal exemption, not a change in the law of the world. and in the settlement after Paris she had, as we saw, formally conceded her brother a say in her daughter's marriages, which was part of the price of being forgiven. The freedom she bought was for one woman only, and it did not descend. Still, it was a family occasion, and a happy one, and Mary made the journey for it, which by this stage cannot have been easy. There is something in the record about her needing to borrow or scrape together the money for the clothes the occasion demanded, which tells you where the finances of that household stood after 18 years of instalments. She was the King of England's sister, a crowned Queen of France, and getting her daughter respectably married was a financial exercise. She saw it done, and then she went back to Suffolk, and that was the end of her public life. The last months are quiet in the sources, which is itself a kind of evidence. There are no letters full of drama, no scenes, no confrontations. There is a sick duchess in a brick house in the fields, growing weaker. There is the letter to her brother, saying she would be glad to see him, that she had been a great while out of his sight, and hoped not to be so long again. That is the note it ends on. Not defiance, not fury, just a woman who wanted her brother back before it was too late. And I want to pause here, before the end, and put the whole of it in front of you, because the last summer of her life is the right place to weigh what she had done with it. She was 37 years old. She had been, in strict order, the youngest and most petted child of the first Tudor king, a girl who lost her mother at 6 and her family's warmth with it, the affianced bride of the man who became the most powerful monarch in the world, a Queen of France crowned at Saint-Denis, a widow in a black room at 19, a woman who committed what the law called treason for the sake of a marriage she wanted, the wife of a duke for 18 years, the mother of 4 children, and the stepmother of 2 more, and a woman who told the King of England to his face that he was wrong about his wife and would not take it back. Almost none of that was what she had been raised for. The training was for a foreign throne, and she reached one and held it for 82 days, and then walked away from every prospect of another, and spent the remaining 18 years of her life in a Suffolk field. Judged by the standards of the world she was born into, that is a failed career. She should have been an empress. She was, at the end, a country duchess with a debt, but judged another way. She is one of the very few women of her rank in that entire century who got to make the central decision of her own life and then live inside it. Catherine of Aragon did not. Anne Boleyn did not, whatever she thought at the time. Mary's own sister did not, nor her daughters, nor her granddaughter. Mary did. Once at 19 in a chapel in Paris at enormous risk, she chose, and the choice held for the rest of her life, and nobody ever took it away from her. Her motto, which she had chosen for herself and had set on her possessions, was that the will of God was sufficient for her. She lived under a system that told her constantly what she was for and what she must accept, and she found in that sentence a way of saying that there was one authority above all the kings arranging her, and that she answered to it. It is a very devout thing to say, and it is also, if you turn it slightly to the light, a very defiant one. And then, on a June morning at Westhorpe, it ended. She died between 7 and 8 o'clock in the morning on the 25th of June, 1533, at Westhorpe Hall in Suffolk, at the age of 37, and I will tell the ending plainly, because that is what it deserves. We do not know what killed her. The pain in her side had troubled her for at least 13 years, and the sweating sickness of 1528 had taken something out of her that never came back, and she had been visibly declining for months. Her biographers have suggested a heart complaint, or tuberculosis, or a cancer, and the honest answer is that nobody can say. She was ill for a long while, and then she died of it, under her own roof, in the early morning of a June day. Who was in the room with her we do not know. Her husband had been at court for the coronation only weeks before, and the record does not tell us whether he reached Westhorpe in time, and I am not going to invent a deathbed scene for her when the sources decline to give one. What we know is the hour and the house, and that she was 37. What happened next was one of the most magnificent funerals England staged in that decade, and the detail of it is worth having, because in death Mary Tudor got to be exactly what she had spent 18 years quietly insisting she was. She lay in state at Westhorpe for 3 weeks. Her body was embalmed and placed in the chapel of the house, and candles burned around it day and night for the whole of that time, and members of the household kept watch in shifts. It was midsummer, and the country outside was in full green, and inside the house a queen lay in the candlelight with people praying beside her through the short nights. Her brother, in London, ordered a requiem mass to be sung for her soul at Westminster Abbey on the 10th of July. Whatever had passed between them over Catherine and Anne, he buried it and gave his sister the full weight of royal mourning. On the 20th of July the coffin left Westhorpe for the last journey, 15 miles or so across Suffolk to the Abbey at Bury St Edmunds, and the procession was extraordinary. The hearse was drawn by 6 horses draped in black cloth. The coffin, of lead, was covered with a pall of black cloth of gold, and on top of it lay an effigy of Mary, made in her likeness, dressed in robes of estate, wearing a crown, holding a golden sceptre. A crown and a sceptre, not a duchess's coronet. She had been Queen of France for 82 days, nearly 20 years before, in a marriage she had wept over and never wanted. And she had held on to that title with both hands for the rest of her life, and when they carried her across Suffolk they carried her as a queen. The canopy over the coffin was borne by 4 of her husband's knights. Standard bearers walked with the arms of Brandon and of Tudor. 100 torch bearers went with the procession, and behind the hearse walked her daughter Frances, 15 years old, married 8 weeks, as chief mourner, with her sister Eleanor beside her and her husband's ward, Catherine Willoughby, among the company. Her own husband did not attend, and neither did her brother the king. That was not coldness. It was the custom of the age, which held that the closest male relatives did not walk in the funeral procession. But it does mean that the person who led Mary Tudor to her grave was a 15-year-old girl who would one day be the mother of a queen of 9 days. The coffin reached the Abbey Church at Bury at 2 in the afternoon on the 20th of July and was received by the abbot and carried into the nave and set before the high altar, and the funeral was held on the 22nd, with a French delegation attending alongside the English mourners in recognition of what she had been. Bury St Edmunds was then one of the richest and greatest abbeys in England, an enormous Norman church with the shrine of a martyred king behind the altar. She was buried there. And then the world she had lived in came apart, and it moved her. Within 6 years her brother had broken with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and pulled down the abbey at Bury St Edmunds. The church where she lay was stripped and unroofed and quarried for its stone, and today only fragments of it stand, great ragged lumps of rubble core with the facing robbed away, in what is now a public garden. Before or during that destruction her body was taken out and moved to the parish church of St Mary, close by, where she lies to this day, and where there is a slab and a memorial to her. She would have hated the reason for the move. The dissolution was the direct consequence of the marriage she had opposed with everything she had. There is one last detail, and it is my favourite in this entire story. In 1784, more than 250 years after she was buried, alterations were being made to St Mary's Church, and her grave was disturbed, and her coffin was opened. And inside they found her hair, long, and, by every account still that remarkable red gold, the colour that ambassadors had written home about, that had hung loose down her back at Abbeville when she was 18 years old, that made half of Europe call her the most beautiful princess of the age. 2.5 centuries in the dark, and the one thing everyone had noticed about her was still there. Locks of it were taken away as relics, and some survive in collections to this day. Of everything she was, that is what lasted. Though there is one other thing of hers still in the world, and it is worth knowing about before we let her go. There is one more thing of hers still in the world, and you can go and look at it, and I think it makes a fitting companion to the hair in the coffin. So let me tell you about the ship. In the first year of her brother's reign, when Mary was 13 or 14, the new king ordered the building of warships at Portsmouth. He had come to the throne with money and ambition and an appetite for the sort of glory his careful father had never chased, and a navy was part of that. 2 vessels were laid down, and the larger of them was launched in about 1511, and she was named the Mary Rose. Now, the naming. It has been said for a very long time that she was named for the king's younger sister, coupled with the Tudor rose, the badge of the dynasty. Some modern historians have questioned it and pointed out that the evidence is not as firm as the tradition suggests, and that Henry may simply have been honouring the Virgin Mary along with his family emblem. I will not pretend the matter is settled, but the association is old, and it is entirely plausible, and the second ship built alongside her was named for their grandmother, which does rather suggest a family theme. Certainly the connection has been made for centuries, and if you go to Portsmouth today, the story is told there. She was a carrack, high-castled fore and aft, and she was among the first warships in England, built from the outset to fight with heavy guns, firing through ports cut in her sides, rather than simply carrying soldiers to board an enemy. That was a genuine change in how war at sea was done, and she was at the front of it. She was a favourite of the king's, refitted and enlarged over the years, and she served for well over 3 decades, which was a long working life for a wooden ship. And on the 19th of July 1545, while manoeuvring to engage a French fleet in the Solent, off Portsmouth, she heeled over and took water through her open gun ports and went down very quickly. With almost all of those aboard her, her brother watched it happen. Henry VIII was at Southsea Castle on the shore that day, and the ship went down in front of him, and there is an account of the cries carrying across the water. Charles Brandon was with him, or nearby, among the commanders. It was one of the last things Brandon did. He died the following month. So the ship that carried Mary Tudor's name was lost fighting the French 12 years after she died, in front of her brother and her husband in the last summer of her husband's life. If a novelist arranged that, you would put the book down. She lay on the seabed for 437 years, silting over, half of her preserved in the mud, and half of her eaten away. And then in 1982, what remained of her hull was lifted out of the Solent in one of the most ambitious archaeological operations ever attempted, and taken ashore and put in a building in Portsmouth where you can walk in and look at her. And the extraordinary thing about the Mary Rose is not the timbers, remarkable as they are, it is everything that came up with her, because the mud that took her also kept her, and what was recovered was not merely a ship, but an entire working world, frozen at the instant it stopped, thousands of objects, the ordinary property of ordinary men, longbows, hundreds of them, and the arrows to go with them, cooking pots and wooden bowls and spoons with their owners' marks scratched on, leather shoes, a backgammon set, combs, some with the nits still in the teeth, musical instruments, the surgeon's chest with his instruments and his jars still in it, a pocket sundial, somebody's dog. It is the most complete picture we have of daily life in that century, better than any document, because documents record what people thought worth writing down, and this records what they actually had in their pockets on a July afternoon. I bring you all of this because of the strange arithmetic of what survives. The Mirror of Naples, the most valuable object in Mary's story, worth a great estate, fought over by 2 kingdoms, is gone entirely, broken up and scattered and untraceable. The palace she was born in is gone. The abbey they buried her in was pulled down by her own brother within 6 years and stands in fragments. Westhorpe Hall, where she raised her children and died, was demolished in the 1760s, and there is nothing of it now but the shape of a moat in a field. And what remains is this: a lock of red gold hair in a Suffolk church, found by accident by workmen 2.5 centuries after she was buried, and a ship in Portsmouth that may or may not have been named for her, with a comb and a bowl and somebody's shoes laid out beside it. The grand things all went, the small things stayed. There is a lesson in that which I am not going to spell out, because it is late and you are nearly asleep, and anyway, I think you have already got it. Let me tell you what became of the people she left behind, because the years after her death are a hard lesson in how quickly the 16th century closed over a woman, and because out of it all came the one thing she is most remembered for now. Her husband remarried within 3 months. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, took as his 4th wife his own ward, Catherine Willoughby, who was 14 years old and who had been betrothed to his son. He needed her fortune. Mary had been dead since June. He was married again by September. It is difficult not to flinch at that, and I do not think we should entirely swallow the flinch. Even by the standards of the age it was fast, and the arrangement, a man of about 50 marrying a girl of 14 who had been intended for his own boy, is not comfortable reading. What can be urged in mitigation is that his finances were desperate, largely because of the fine he had been paying since 15 for marrying Mary in the first place, and that the marriage of wards for money was entirely routine and entirely legal. What cannot be claimed is that it was a tribute to his first love. He got on with it. The following March her surviving son Henry, Earl of Lincoln, was gone too. He was in his early teens. With him went the last male line of that marriage, and everything Mary and Brandon had made together now rested in their 2 daughters. Catherine Willoughby, it should be said, turned out to be a remarkable woman in her own right, a fierce and intelligent evangelical, who became a considerable figure in the religious politics of the next reign. She bore Brandon 2 sons. Both of them died of the sweating sickness on the same day in 1551, within an hour of each other as young men. Brandon himself died in August of 1545, 18 months before the king. Henry VIII buried his oldest friend at Windsor at his own expense, and is said to have remarked that in all the years of their acquaintance, Brandon had never knowingly betrayed a friend or taken unfair advantage of an enemy. It is a generous epitaph from a man not much given to them, and it is worth noting that the one occasion on which Brandon had comprehensively betrayed him was the marriage that produced this story, and that Henry had evidently forgiven it entirely. Eleanor, the younger daughter, married into the north and died in 1547, still young, and Francis lived and had children, and the eldest of them was Jane. Here is the last turn of the story, and it is a dark one, because Mary Tudor was a daughter of Henry VII. Her blood carried a claim to the English throne. Because her brother, in his will, put her line ahead of their sister Margaret's Scottish line, that claim was live and it was near. And so in the summer of 1553, when the boy King Edward was dying and the men around him wanted to keep the crown from his Catholic sister, they reached for Mary's granddaughter. Jane Grey was about 16. She was intelligent, seriously learned, and devout, and she did not want it. She was proclaimed queen, reigned for 9 days, was deposed, and was beheaded at the Tower in February of 1554. Her father was executed with her. Her mother Frances survived, remarried, and lived quietly until 1559. So the red gold Tudor blood that Mary carried out of that palace on the Thames ran down through Frances into Jane and killed her. There is no way to make that anything other than bleak, and I am not going to try. But it is not the only thing she left behind, and I do not want to end there. What she gave us, first, is a fact that is easy to say and very hard to appreciate. She chose in an age in which women of her rank were currency, moved between kingdoms to seal treaties, married at 11 and widowed at 19, and remarried at 20, and never once asked what they wanted, Mary Tudor asked. And then when the promise she had extracted looked like being quietly forgotten, she went and made it true herself, at the risk of her husband's head and her own ruin, and she made it stick. She is one of a tiny handful of royal women in the whole of that century who married the person she wanted to marry. What she left, second, is harder to name, and it has to do with what a promise is worth. Her whole life turned on one, spoken in a private room by a man who did not expect to be held to it. She held him to it. And then she spent her last years watching that same man argue that a marriage of 20 years standing had never existed at all, and she told him to his face that he was wrong, and would not take it back, and died estranged from the person she had loved longest in the world rather than pretend otherwise. She understood, better than almost anyone at that court, what it costs when the powerful decide that their word was provisional, and what she left, third, is a question worth carrying to sleep with you. She could have had the world. She was betrothed to the man who became the master of Europe. She was crowned in Saint-Denis. Had she played the game she was raised for, she would have been queen somewhere else within a year of Louise's death, with everything that goes with it. She gave the whole of that away, deliberately, in a small chapel in Paris, for one particular man, and she gave it away at 19, when almost nobody has the judgment for such a decision. We cannot know whether she ever regretted it, but we know she signed herself the French Queen to the end of her life, and we know she was carried to her grave wearing a crown, and we know she stayed married to Charles Brandon to the end and buried children with him, and told the King of England to his face that he was wrong about his wife. That does not sound to me like a woman who thought she had made a mistake. And now let her rest, the French Queen, in the parish church at Bury St. Edmunds, where they moved her when the abbey came down, under her slab, with her hair still that impossible red gold in the dark, 5 centuries after a Venetian looked at her and could think of nothing to call her but a paradise. Let the Suffolk country settle into the night around her. Let the fields go quiet, the flat green miles of them, the hedges and the water meadows and the slow rivers, the tall wool churches standing dark against the last of the sky. Let the village of Westhorpe sleep, where the brick house used to stand with its moat and its gardens and its noisy full nursery. All of it gone now, the moat still there in the grass, holding the shape of a place where a woman who might have been an empress raised her children instead. Let the abbey at Bury sleep, or what remains of it, the great ragged fragments standing in the gardens, and the church beside it where she lies. Let the candles that burned around her for 3 weeks in that midsummer be long out. Let the 6 black horses be unharnessed, and the effigy with its crown and its little golden sceptre be put away, and the 15-year-old girl who walked behind the hearse go home. And let Paris sleep too, far away across the water, where the Hôtel de Cluny still stands in its courtyard among the plane trees, and where there is a chapel in which a girl of 19 10 weeks out of a black hung room married the man she had chosen in front of 10 people and a king, and gambled everything she had on being forgiven. Let that quiet room be quiet. Let Abbeville sleep, where she came in through streets hung with tapestry with her hair loose down her back, 18 years old and frightened and word perfect. Let Saint-Denis sleep, with its dead kings, where they put a crown on her. And let the palace on the Thames sleep, the one that burned and was rebuilt and renamed, where a March morning in 1496 brought the last of Elizabeth of York's children who would live to grow up. The youngest of them, the pretty one, the one everybody indulged, with nothing yet decided about her, and her whole extraordinary life still in front of her. Let her be at peace now. She was sold once, and she did not complain. She stood in a foreign church and said the words and was gracious about it. And then, when her moment came, she took it with both hands, and she never gave it back, and she was still calling herself a Queen of France when they carried her out of that Suffolk house at midsummer with the whole country green around her. She has earned her quiet. There is nothing left to arrange for her, no king to obey, no ship to board, no promise left to hold anybody to. If tonight has done its work and eased you towards sleep, then there will be another such evening here for you, whenever you would like one. And should you care to tell me, before you drift off, which corner of the earth you are lying in tonight, and what your own clock says? I do love reading those afterwards. Thank you for the hours we have spent together here. It has been a real pleasure to share them with you. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.